One when 8 billion people woke up on top of a drowned city, climbing a mile out of a black Dead Sea. The system handed almost everyone a working weapon, but gave him a talent the entire survivor network laughed at because all it did was repair broken junk. They called him the junk man before he even took his first step. But what none of them realized was that in a sunken world, junk is actually king. His system did not merely fix what it touched, but actually restored it one tier beyond its former glory. The only way off this flooding spire was down, right toward whatever had broken the world on purpose, so he let them laugh and hid how strong the rubble actually made him. Then he began to descend. The first thing he felt was the freezing water, cold around his ankles, and rising while a sky the color of a bruise pressed down on a tier of broken towers, stretching out flat toward a landless horizon. 10,000 survivors had surfaced on this very top tier of the massive spire, and the ones nearest him were already screaming in terror, clutching whatever gear they had been given, spinning in circles on a flooded plaza of cracked concrete and rusted railings. The whole area had once been the crown of some colossal building, now submerged neck-deep in a dead ocean. That ruin was the first thing his eyes wanted to inspect, while everyone else desperately searched for an exit. He did not scream. Panic had never once fixed a broken thing in his life, and the world around him was nothing but broken things waiting to be analyzed. The drowned spire net flashed open right inside his vision before he could even take a full breath, delivering the rules in a cold voice with no humanity behind it, just the flat certainty of an entity that had done this many times before. Every cycle, the spire would flood higher, meaning he had to descend through its interior layers or drown on the surface. He was also warned to appraise before touching anything, because the deeper layers held salvage that could kill a careless hand before it ever closed around it. A population counter hung in the corner of his vision, reading 10,000 on this tier and 8 billion across the entire spire. As he watched those 8 billion plummeted by the hundreds, talk about a brutal wake-up call. The dead were already starting somewhere below him. His starter kit weighed almost nothing, a grim reality he realized the second he looked at his two basic items. First was a single rusted multi-tool, a cheap folding thing of pitted steel that some previous owner had clearly drowned and abandoned, and the second was the Menforge system itself, displaying its own description across his sight. When he focused on it, at the core of it sat a talent called Restore, which could repair any broken object, structure, or even dead creature, returning it not just to working order, but to one tier above its absolute best. His second talent was the Appraisal Eye, which could instantly read the true history, danger, and weak points of anything before his hand ever touched it. Plus, a hidden system perk that had no real weight to it completely concealed his own personal stats from the appraisal eyes of every other survivor on the spire. He had read only about half of it when the survivor network branded him. Since anyone could publicly appraise anyone else, someone nearby had inspected his kit and laughed so loudly that the mockery spread before he could even close. The description, a guy just 6 steps away with a working assault rifle, pointed right at him, telling the entire plaza that the system had handed an apocalyptic janitor. The nickname Junk Man spread across the network to 10,000 people. It took just a single breath to slap a label on him when he couldn't peel off, so he let it stay. A guy who can turn trash into deadly weapons becomes a target the second anyone figures him out. Being understood was the one luxury he could not afford on this massive spire, where a massive population of 8 billion was already 900,000 lighter. Survivors with decent gear were already banding together into those loud, arrogant groups. They always crowd around whoever holds the weapons, leaving the weak behind. Meanwhile, those without weapons were quickly learning the brutal second lesson of any major disaster. The people holding the guns always decide who gets to eat, so he stepped back. He slipped away from the crowd toward the flooded edge of the plaza, where rubble piled high. Nobody else wanted to be there, but that ruined junk was exactly where his eyes shined. They saw trash, he saw gold. The rising water was past his shins. It climbed fast, carrying the shattered debris of a drowned world. His appraisal skill locked onto a hidden object, making him crouch down into the freezing water. Without a second thought, he reached in. It was a blade, or what remained of one. A service knife snapped clean in half, rusted to the same dead orange as the rubble. Before his fingers even brushed the metal, his appraisal eye revealed its tragic history. The skill poured the entire sad life of this broken weapon right into his mind. It was a simple, quiet realization. This knife had actually been forged twice and failed twice. A lazy blacksmith had reforged it after its first break, cutting corners on the temper. Naturally, it snapped again the very day the flood arrived, failing right at the old weld. Zero danger, less than zero value. This thing was complete junk. To any other survivor, this was just useless trash, not even worth the effort of bending down. But he picked it up anyway, feeling his restoration power surge right behind his eyes. It was a familiar pressure that would return thousands of times, a silent, demanding question. It asked how far past its original limits he wanted to push this blade, and the cost. Would cost him, there was a resource called mental charge, a small reservoir of it inside him that this first restoration would barely dent. He spent what the broken knife needed and watched his skill wrap around the two rusted halves. In his palm, the rust lifted off the steel, falling away as black flakes onto the rising water. On his palm, the jagged break drew itself shut without a seam. The metal didn't just return to its former state, it surpassed it, leaving a clean gray edge with a faint blue line of temper down its spine that no smith in the old world could ever have managed to forge. That newly restored knife sat in his hand, sharper than it had ever been before. In that single, frozen breath, he understood exactly what he had been gifted and exactly why he needed to hide it. All around him, 1,000 desperate survivors were fighting over the few intact weapons scattered across the plaza. Meanwhile, he stood ankle-deep in an entire graveyard of broken things that his hands could transform into weapons far superior to anything they were carrying. The math clicked in his head with a cold clarity he usually only felt over workbench. Talk about a massive advantage. They fought over a shrinking pile while he had stumbled onto an infinite supply of gear that they were standing on and calling garbage. But he didn't get long to admire his work. The first swarm came out of the flooded stairwells while the armed factions were still arguing over who was in charge. They poured up from below like a gray-brown tide of drowned rats. They were as massive as dogs, with strangely jointed legs and slick black water. His appraisal eye scanned them in an instant, long before they could reach him. Every weak point stood exposed, especially the soft seam right under the jaw. The spine ran shallow there. Suddenly, the entire plaza erupted in screams. Panicked men wasted precious ammunition on a swarm that did not care. 3 of the beasts broke away from the main tide, rushing straight at him. He stood unarmed at the edge, but his newly restored blade did the impossible. It sliced clean through the first giant rat's jaw, bypassing bone easily. The point emerged from the back of its skull on a clean draw he barely leaned into. He required absolutely no effort to cut down the second beast mid-leap. The third beast lunged. He let it get close, letting its own weight carry it. It ran directly onto his point. He stepped back calmly into the rubble. 3 dead monsters sank into the flood. His knife remained clean without a single chip. Nobody noticed his swift kills. Everyone else was busy surviving. The network was a wall of panic, burying his quiet kills under intense noise. 3 silent kills were lost beneath thousands of louder, brutal deaths. This total anonymity was his second gift, worth more than the blade. Because a survivor who stays off the radar is someone nobody wants to rob. He crouched quietly in the wreckage as the swarm thinned, reading the feed. He scanned the network differently than the others, looking for real, solid patterns. While others drowned in terror, he searched for the hidden structure. Loud boasts about prices surfaced first. Beneath them lay a brutal reality. 10,000 strangers were sorted into those who exploit and those who get taken. Up on the dry stone, armed groups of survivors traded tense threats. Men with the most guns claimed the high ground, demanding taxes. They claimed the right to tax anyone who wanted to stand on safe ground. On the trade channels, desperate survivors posted their very first offers. They realized within the hour that this system did not give them a fair start. He quietly marked the loudest players and memorized the plaza's choke points. He let the debris show him which sunken scraps would be most useful. He kept track of salvage. After all, a planner is the only one who survives. While everyone else panics, he stays alive. Soon, the rat swarm was depleted. He folded the weapon away, while the armed factions wasted more bullets. They were still frantically shooting at the final dead beasts. He let the network keep calling him the junk man. It was his best armor. The global population counter had already plummeted by another 40,000. He stood quietly at the flooded edge, observing the sheer scale of devastation. He did the only thing he actually trusted himself to do: watch. The freezing water was rising past his knees, climbing the rubble far too quickly. He quickly pulled up the system network to check the official flood schedule. He compared the system's statistics against the physical reality on the concrete. The reality was terrifying. The system's statistics and the rising tide did not agree. Water was rising much faster than promised. He was the only one noticing. He was the only person on the entire tier who had stopped panicking. He moved 20 steps along the edge, salvaging whatever caught his eye. Metal was worth the wait. Suddenly, a woman in a salvager harness stops right in front of him, staring down at the folded knife resting against his worn-out belt. She has dark oil stains coating her only arm up to the elbow. Her other side ends in a blunt, empty wrist. This is the brutal result of a sudden, violent tear. Rather than a clean cut, she wastes no time pointing out his strange, hidden blade. She heard him pull that piece of scrap metal from the rubble. Broken metal never sings when splitting a skull, but his weapon had sung. She wants to know what a simple janitor did to a piece of absolute garbage to make it slice like that. He gives her the easiest answer possible, claiming he just got lucky with a sharp piece of metal. But she flatly replies that she grades salvage for a living and has never once seen anyone get lucky with a cheap service knife. Her name is Han So-young. She says, and before the transport, she was a top-tier salvage engineer who could tell the exact grade of steel just by the sound it made when failing. That was how she knew the knife on his belt had failed, then became completely indestructible. He notes that she is not threatening him, nor is she trying to expose his secrets anywhere. A woman who instantly figured out his abilities but kept quiet is either the most dangerous person on this tier or the most useful. Now he is about to find out which. So-young holds up her blunt wrist and demands her price for keeping his secret, wasting absolutely no time at all. She wants her hand back, the one the transport ripped away from her body. She had carried the dead prosthetic all the way up the spire in her salvage harness. It is a ruined piece of casing no normal survivor would want. The dead machine is placed in his free hand while she watches him closely. He lets his appraisal eye open, and the history of the object floods in. It was a good machine once, now completely drowned, crushed, and utterly broken. The control board is cracked, leaving it 3 tiers below any working gear. It would never work under the ordinary rules of this dead world, but those rules do not apply to him. He tells her the truth is too expensive for her. Instead, he offers to trade a restored hand for her absolute silence on the matter. She agrees instantly, but restoring this machine takes a massive, heavy toll. It drains far more energy than the knife, emptying his reservoir quite rapidly and leaving a deep, painful ache in his chest. Still, he concentrates. The dead prosthetic begins to reshape itself right inside his open hand. The cracked control board seals shut, and the seized actuators tighten perfectly. The heavy outer casing snaps closed, forming a hand a tier above her old one. It is faster, stronger, and reads nerve signals with extreme precision. She sockets the new device onto her wrist, flexing the metallic fingers. The flawless precision of the movement makes her freeze. Then she whispers that this new hand is even better than the one she was born with. She does not thank him, which he respects, because cheap gratitude means absolutely nothing. So-young promises absolute silence about his identity, ensuring his secret is completely safe. She will find valuable junk for him to restore faster than he ever could alone. In exchange, she expects a fair share of their salvaged loot. He agrees to the terms, setting incredibly steep rules for any outsiders who join. They shake on it using the new hand. He has officially gained his very first ally. She was the only one on the spire who knew his secret, the first he did not have to hide from. The two of them worked the dying top tier together, while the other survivors wasted their resources around them. Up on the dry stone, the armed groups finished off the rat swarm and turned, like armed mobs always do, to the brutal task of robbing the unarmed. A cold hierarchy was forming on the plaza. Real-time men with rifles taxing those without weapons, just for the right to stand on the flooding concrete. Sayuan and he stayed at the rubble edge where nobody with a gun saw profit. She grabbed broken gear faster than he ever could. Alone, she pointed out cracked power cells and snapped braces, lying around, completely ignored by thugs who were busy fighting over the few intact weapons on the dry stone. What she possessed that the armed men lacked was the rare gift to look at drowned ruins and hear what they used to be. Its steel grade, the sound when flexed, and the shape of a machine in its silent, dead parts. She fed him a stream of targets faster than his hands could keep up with. He restored a cracked power cell back past. Full, feeling it sit warm and heavy with a charge it never held when new. Then, he brought a snapped bracket back as a clamp to hold a wall together. Under pressure that would have torn the original loose, they stacked the finished pieces in a flooded shop bay, while the plaza behind them thinned of the living. The two of them fell into a smooth rhythm as the rising water reached his thighs, her sharp ear in his hands, working a dead world they could never have conquered alone. For the first time since surfacing, he was no longer just surviving a disaster but a man with a supply line on a drowning spire. That was the difference between dying today and dying last, a pretty brutal reality to face. His head like a math problem he kept turning over, up on the dry concrete. 100 armed survivors were dividing up a pile of working gear that could only ever shrink. Every single bullet they fired and every kit they broke only subtracted from a total that nothing on this dead spire could ever replenish. Down in the water, where Sayuan and he crouched, their supply did not shrink because the supply was the ruin itself, an entire drowned world of broken, rusted, and crushed things that his hands restored beyond factory-new quality, while every armed thug on the tier walked right past, calling it worthless trash. They were fighting over what was running out while he stood waist-deep in what would never run dry, the only thing keeping that secret from getting him killed. Honestly, not a single one of them could see it. Flood quickly settled the question of how long they could enjoy this arrangement because the water rose a full cycle early. A schedule had been posted on the net, promised that the surface would hold until the next mark before rising again, but the rising tides broke that promise by a hand width and then another. While he watched the water line crawl up the rubble, the population counter answered it. Before the survivors even realized, the 8 billion total shedding numbers faster than it had all day as the deep layers drowned the careless. Pure panic surged through the net like a solid wall. 10,000 people on this tier alone realized at once that the very floor they stood on was about to become the sea. Sayuan read it off his face before he could even speak, pointing out that there was exactly one escape route off a tier going under, which was the descent shaft, and that shaft was going to be a nightmare. Things were already a problem. Cyan warned him that a man named Castledorn got there first. He had enough firepower to lock down the only exit off this drowning floor. He turned it into a toll booth. Dorn already posted his rates for all to see. The panic was real. Survivors realized they had no choice but to pay up. Most of them handed over rifles and kits just to buy their safety. Others paid with far worse. Meanwhile, the network's public feed was already flooded with bids from terrified people who realized the man at the shaft essentially owned their lives. He kept the network interface wide open, quietly scanning the entire plaza, reading the sheer panic for what it hid rather than what it screamed. The ascent ranking board had only just begun to populate, a leaderboard the system used to track how deep each survivor pushed down the spire. At this point, almost every single name sat at 0 because barely anyone had gone down. Dorn's name sat near the very top of the board for one simple reason: he simply claimed the door instead of actually descending through it. A rank built on owning the path instead of walking it. He noted that as a glaring weakness. Meanwhile, the trade channel scrolled with desperate posts from survivors offering their working rifles for a single passage or a coat for a spot in line. One guy was even offering everything he owned just for a hollow promise of safety. Those insane prices proved one thing: the sudden flood had completely shattered the confidence of 10,000 clueless people. He pulled the public network feed up, reading Dorn's posted terms carefully, like analyzing a broken machine, actively searching for the fatal flaw beneath it. And that flaw was clear. Dorn thought the shaft was the only valuable thing. On a level otherwise filled with garbage, he was correct about the path down, but completely wrong about everything else. He filed that mistake away as they moved. The rising water was already up to his waist now, climbing up the rubble relentlessly. The digital schedule claimed it should not be flooding, but the countdown kept ticking. In his vision, Scion stayed close to his shoulder, flexing the prosthetic hand he made for her as they waded through the flooding plaza toward the only exit. Dorn's operation ran the shaft exactly as she warned, surrounded by armed guards. Standing on the last dry stone of the level, the dark exit mouth right behind them, desperate survivors queued up in a long line, shedding their gear to pay the toll. Finding Dorn himself was incredibly easy. A heavy, imposing man who did not even carry his own rifles. His lackeys carried them. Instead, he watched the miserable line with the smug satisfaction of someone who found the absolute perfect choke point in a massive disaster and decided to capitalize on it. When our hero finally emerged from the deep water in his ragged scavenger clothes, possessing no visible weapons, Dorn grinned with that classic greedy look from online. Standing across the wet stone, he loudly summoned the junk man to pay up. Like the rest of them, then, with his crew laughing, he mockingly asked what a simple trash picker could possibly offer to avoid drowning here. With the dark, rising tide at his back and weapons blocking his way, he slowly walked right up to Dorn's line with his hands open. And completely empty, a submissive posture always buys more time than a threatening one that only invites a bloody gunfight. It is a standard move. They send one guy over with a public scanner. They want to see what he is carrying before deciding his toll. He just lets them. That scanner guy stares as long as he wants. Thankfully, the auto-hide function works perfectly. Just as the system promised, the scan returns absolutely nothing to the guard. It shows an empty read with zero stats, no real talent, just a bottom-tier survivor. The lowest of the low on this spire, the lackey reports back to Dorn. He tells him the junk man only has a rusty multi-tool and a knife. Nothing else of value. Now Dorn only prices tolls based on visible gear. He decides the easiest way to clear him out is to take that gear. He lets him pass for cheap. Honestly, that plays right into our hero's hands. That rusty multi-tool is the only thing he would ever hand over to Dorn, especially since Suyeon already hid the restored knife up her sleeve during the commotion. While the guards laugh at his pathetic stats, he hands Dorn the multi-tool. He pays a hilariously low toll, stepping right past the guns into the darkness. Suyeon follows a step behind as they enter the descent shaft, zero cost to him. They read as absolutely worthless. Dorn yells some insult after them about the trash. He claims going down to the deep trash won't save him, but he ignores it. He adds it to his list of future payback as the water closes behind them. It completely seals off the tier. Above them, the top of the spire slowly sinks. It completely surrenders to the ocean as they drop deeper. This dark descent shaft pulls them down a wet vertical throat of ruined stairs and elevator shafts. They drop through the freezing dark until the tight shaft suddenly opens wide. They land in a massive drowned concourse. The system net quickly identifies it. Before his eyes can even adjust, the map labels this the first interior level. This place used to be a massive, bustling market inside the Grand Spire. It is an enormous flooded mall stretching out infinitely beneath a dark ceiling. Drowned shopfronts line the flooded avenues, their rotted signs looking like ghosts. Water pressure blew out the windows. Freezing water stands waist-deep in the walkways. It gets even deeper in the sunken bays as other survivors splash down. To everyone else, this is a graveyard of dead stores, but to him, it is the richest room he has ever seen, an endless horizon of broken things. Every single piece of trash can be upgraded to greatness in his hands. Suyeon reads the layout by pure instinct the second they touch down, pointing out which of the dead shops had the best hardware. She knows where the solid metal settled and where everything has rotted away. They target the nearest avenue first, while the other panicked survivors run wild. People pour down the shaft, desperately grabbing whatever they can find. But how those amateurs salvage compared to him is night and day. It represents the whole tragedy of the spire. They hunt for intact items, fighting over sealed cases and unbroken stock in the dark. They completely ignore the rubble, thinking it is totally worthless junk. But in his hands, that exact useless rubble is worth a fortune. He grabs a snapped pry bar from a flooded tool shop and restores it. It becomes a powerful tool that easily folds back a jammed security shutter. Behind the metal shutter lies a hidden stockroom other crews completely abandoned. They moved on because the locked door had beaten them. There was a system to these caches. Net had mapped the concourse, laying out the salvage stores the spire hid away. Across these brutal layers and tiers, a survivor learned to read the signs fast or die poor. At the bottom were the rust caches, common boxes filled with scrap metal and dead batteries. Just above those were the iron caches, much rarer containers holding restorable gear. They held weapons, tools, and sometimes even a rare blueprint worth more than any steel. To most ascenders, it was barely worth their time, just pure garbage. But to him, a simple rust cache was a complete, life-saving feast. Every dead battery was something his restore skill could bring back way past full power. They cleared 2 rust caches and an iron in the very first stretch of avenue. They swept the avenue while armed crews were still fighting over a single weapons case. Just 3 shops down, the battle raged. Meanwhile, Sion kept counting their massive haul. They climbed fast, faster than either of them dared to say out loud. The concourse, it turned out, belonged to Dorn now, just like the shaft had. Because whoever controls the door owns everything, every single person. His enterprise had arrived ahead of the flood, backed by working guns to enforce his rules. Dorn's crew taxed every salvager on this layer, using the same extortion tactics as before. They demanded a cut of every haul just for the right to keep breathing. Armed pairs patrolled the avenues, stopping survivors to shake down anyone who found valuables. Dorn posted his extortionate new tax rates the very hour they landed. Now watch, this is where Dorn made his single biggest mistake. He never connected that trash picker to the ghost clearing caches nearby. In Dorn's mind, that simple junk man was already ancient history, fleeced and forgotten. He probably thought the junk man drowned. He let him believe that lie while working. He targeted Dorn through the only channel the boss respected, the trade market. Dorn ran the net market with an iron fist, just like everything else. He bought salvage from terrified survivors for pennies, then resold it at massive markups. The whole racket worked because Dorn's crew controlled the supply and set the prices. Then he entered that market as a completely unknown salvager with a ridiculous name. A name people laughed at, but his stock was unbelievable. His restored tools and weapons were an entire tier above anything Dorn's crew offered. He priced his items just under Dorn's, offering them quietly to the desperate survivors. Any descender who could buy a fully restored blade from him for cheap. Rather than Dorn's overpriced, chipped weapons did the math in a heartbeat. The customers started bleeding away from Dorn's market toward his incredibly fast. The goods were superior, the prices lower, and the seller was the ghost Dorn ignored. Those trades were the best part. Each one was like a tiny surgery, performed on a man who believed he was the ultimate predator in the room. A descender would approach him with a functional rifle they desperately wanted to keep, and a broken secondary gun they intended to toss. He would offer to trade. He took the broken junk and gave back a restored blade worth 3 of their rifles. The descender would walk away, convinced they had completely fleeced the simple junk man. They gave him literal garbage, along with a thank you for taking it. In return, he gave them something a tier above what Dorn sold at 4 times the price. Both parties left the trade convinced they won, except only one of them was right. He built his stock across the layer, taking in the broken gear that survivors were too ashamed to carry, and fixing it up so well that they actually started seeking him out. Every trade widened the massive gap between what he could offer versus Dorn, costing him nothing but a little energy he would just regenerate by the next cycle. His favorite part of it, the one he enjoyed way too much, was that Dorn could not see the source. To Dorn and his appraisers, he was just buying absolute trash off the layer at dirt cheap scrap prices and turning it into profits that made absolutely no sense. It looked like either a miracle or a massive swindle. Any greedy operator who runs every scheme assumes the one thing they cannot explain is a bigger scam than their own, so Dorn started buying up cheap rubble to choke the supply, paying actual money for snapped blades and dead energy cells he thought he needed. This meant Dorn was burning his cash to corner a market made of the worthless trash his entire edge was built on. Every hoard of junk Dorn stored away to starve him out was trash he no longer had to find. Suyeon let out her first real laugh when she realized their rival was buying their raw materials for them. Meanwhile, his personal descent rank had silently started to climb. Quietly, exactly the way he preferred everything about himself to move in this place. The system measured rank by how deep and how well a survivor pushed into the lower layers. Salvaged areas secured caches territory held, and his rank climbed steadily off the very bottom, while his registered name remained the joke of the layer. On the main concourse board, the junk man sat pretty high among all the other descenders who had arrived with him, higher than teams with 3 working rifles and active crews. Not a single person looked twice at his position because the name of his joke name, Dorn's own rank, had stalled because simply owning territory is not the same as descending. The gap between taxing a layer and taking was widening on the board in plain numbers if anyone bothered to check. But nobody bothered reading the stats of a mere trash picker, yet Dorn slowly figured it out, far slower than his market did, slow as a man who notices His shoes are completely soaked only after standing in a puddle for an hour. His crew finally brought him the reports, trade bleeding away, rubble prices spiking without reason, and cheap restored gear flooding the lair from some mysterious source. Then a survivor somewhere finally put the pieces together out loud. They connected the trash picker to the quiet merchant eating their market. He watched the shift ripple through the net, much like watching a flood rising. The public forums carried Dorn's changing mood, shifting from sheer contempt into something much darker as his messages turned from cheap mockery to warnings. And just like that, the quiet game was over. Suyeon noticed them first. A heavily armed squad of Dorn's men broke off from the avenues, marching toward their bay. They were no longer interested in just taxing his salvaged goods. Now they wanted everything. Dorn's clear order had gone out to seize every single piece of the trash picker's gear and bring him in too. He had been waiting for Dorn to finally send his men. An expected threat is just an opportunity to handpick your own battleground, and he had chosen his ground 3 avenues back. Long before Dorn ever gave the order, right at the bay where he and Suyeon stacked their haul. A dead concourse block, a drowned market corner abandoned by the city. 4 collapsed shop fronts surrounded a flooded plaza with only one entrance. No armor-clad man could ever squeeze in elsewhere. To Dorn's crew, it looked like a cornered animal's den, a trash picker hiding with his stolen loot. But he built that exact illusion on purpose, working hard to trick them. He salvaged for 2 whole cycles to turn this dead block into something real. His restore skill did to a building what it does to a blade, bringing it past former glory. He had been running that power on the block in pieces, secretly out-trading the local racket. While they were distracted, he quietly restored a dead power line running deep beneath the plaza. For the first time since the Great Flood, the long-dead corner drank active electrical current. Soft green lights began flickering to life inside drowned shop fronts that had been dark forever. Next, he targeted the collapsed front of the old corner store, restoring it. The rubble literally drew itself upward, reshaping into fitted stone tougher than before. Denser than any normal concrete. Then, the bent security shutter at the entrance transformed into a massive security gate, fully powered by the electricity he had just restored. This level of restoration cost serious energy, draining his internal reservoir down to the absolute limit. He spent the very last of his power on the things that mattered most, the traps. To any normal survivor walking past, a snapped pressure plate was just useless garbage. But through his appraisal eye, it was a working defense grid waiting to be revived. His goal was a defense system, far tougher than anything this mall had ever seen. Pulling the bones of the old security system from the rubble, he got to work. He restored the broken pressure plates, hiding them deep under the plaza's murky standing water. Completely invisible, then he wired those restored relays directly to the main gate. This dead block was no longer a cornered animal's den, it was a lethal machine. One wrong step from an intruder, and the whole place would react instantly. Suyeon walked through the finished bay and went completely quiet, stunned by what she saw. She admitted she had spent her entire career raiding heavily armed enemy strongholds. Yet she had never seen a fortress built from the exact trash everyone else ignored. And it was built by a man the entire layer still dismissed as a mere janitor. Soon enough, Dorn's crew marched confidently through the wide entrance of the bay. 8 heavily armed men with the arrogant posture of predators who never expect trouble. They thought they were just hunting a defenseless trash picker and his easy loot. They did not even bother to check the bay because they assumed it was worthless. And that right there was the exact hook of his perfect trap. They could not recognize a lethal fortress built from things they were trained to ignore. The moment their last man crossed the threshold, the heavy gate slammed shut behind them. The standing water suddenly lit up as the hidden pressure plates detected their weight. The dead market corner he spent 2 cycles building instantly came alive. Surrounding 8 intruders who had walked in absolutely certain they held all the power. He did not even need to kill them, which was a very deliberate choice. Dead men leave grudges, but a broken crew is a lesson the whole layer will remember. The relays locked the gate and immediately surged heavy current through the flooded plaza. The restored walls folded inward, squeezing them tightly into a pre-built choke point. Dorn's 8 men collapsed into the electrified water, utterly paralyzed. Tangled, shocked, and disarmed before they even realized the trap had sprung. Teeth, he and Suyeon snatched up their rifles while they were still hitting the floor. Leaving them with their lives and nothing else, 8 armed thugs reduced to Shivering survivors, they carried the story of his block up the avenues. Faster than any post he could write, and while binding the leaders. Hands with scrap cable, the man did what they all forgot to do earlier. Looked around, the junk man watched the thug's face as he scanned the area. Calculating the reality that everyone else had ignored all day, he looked at walls. Built far better than poured stone, a gate running clean energy in a dead world. And an active defense grid crafted from the broken metal his own crew had blindly swam past to get here, with the raw terror of a man who just realized the sheer scale of his mistake. He whispered that this scavenger possessed far better gear than Dorn's whole gang, using junk they tax others for. Every single wall and trap was made from the very trash they had stepped right over to chase some old rifles he let the guy sit with. That brutal realization, a living witness who spreads the truth, is worth far more to the network than a useless corpse, so he sent all 8 back up the streets too. Spread the word. The network shifted instantly that hour, and he watched it happen. Just like he had predicted back at the plaza, it turned out Dorn had treated this junk man as a massive joke ever since the shaft, a meme his crew and buyers constantly laughed at. But look at this, now the official rankings were out for everyone to see, and that mocked scavenger was sitting high, ranking in the top 50 of the entire layer, above Dorn and above every gang that had bullied the market. Soon, the survivors Dorn had exploited came to his stronghold openly instead of hiding. The jokes on the public chat channels turned into serious calculations as 10,000 terrified refugees reconsidered who on this dangerous level was actually worth aligning with. The name Junk Man did not disappear, but its meaning shifted, the mockery completely drained, until it became a title for the single scavenger on the strip who could weaponize their worst day. He let the legend grow. A reputation he could guide was worth way more than a cleared name. The real power of his work became crystal clear right after the defense grid went live, when other wanderers who traveled those same flooded paths arrived to trade and realized what his foresight had built. A rival squad nearby had spent the exact same 2 cycles battling other squads for just one locked military crate and a broken generator. By the end of it, they only had a locked box they could not crack open and a useless machine they could never repair. In that same time, using the exact debris they ignored to get their crate, he had built a fully functional stronghold with power, heavy gates, and hidden defenses. The only real difference between his day and theirs was that he could reuse what was broken while they could only fight over intact gear. A trader who visited his gate figured out the harsh reality out loud while standing under the green lights. He told Suyang that he watched 3 separate crews slaughter each other over scraps, while this junk man quietly built the only working stronghold on this layer out of the very trash those squads threw at his feet. He let them say it. A hard truth coming from a stranger was worth infinitely more than his own boasts. He could have claimed the post himself, letting every listening survivor understand little better that the ultimate ally on this dead spire was the one who had absolutely never needed their petty resources. He left Dorn absolutely broken and completely battered, yet functional, which was a calculated choice rather than a moment of mercy. He could have seized his market, his loyal crew, his post, and finished him right there, but dead rival is a useless asset, whereas a broken one now owes his life to the mercy of the man he foolishly tried to rob. Through the trading network, he quietly sent a private trade offer while Dorn's crew was still busy wringing out their soaked clothes, letting him keep a tiny fraction of his racket for delivering every single scrap of concourse rubble he controlled to our protagonist at a very low bargain price, making him a supplier. Dorn understood raw leverage better than anything else. He took the deal because his only other choice was nothing. The scam artist who once ruled the gate now swept trash for the ultimate salvager instead, and the entire layer watched this play out on the map, learning a valuable lesson without him ever needing to repeat it twice. Then, old Marin found him the following morning on a desolate layer where the sun never shined. Half-blind old salvager who had managed to survive those first chaotic cycles when most of the spire did not. She walked into his territory completely unarmed and without fear. This old woman with one blind eye and one piercingly sharp eye stood at his restored gate. She stared at the heavy walls much like Sion did, without analyzing them. She was simply remembering. She claimed she used to walk this concourse back when it was a lively market instead of a massive tomb, easily spotting a building That was merely patched up versus one that had been completely upgraded, and she told him the spire itself remembered its former glory layer by layer, all the way down. When he asked her what she meant, she only warned that anyone who could make ruins remember would be targeted by the dark forces that had worked so hard to make humanity forget. After that, she refused to say anything else, leaving him holding the very first thread of a massive mystery he could not grasp yet. He pondered Marin's words deeply while he and Cyan worked on cataloging the haul, since a warning from a seasoned survivor of the initial cycles was worth far more than any reading his scanner eye could pull from a damaged wall. She had shown absolutely no fear toward his defenses or his magic, unlike the armed gangs, nor did she care about trading, making her the first person whose motives he could not easily calculate. But what truly haunted him was her chilling choice of words that the forces which ruined this world tried to make it forget. A flood drowning a city is a tragedy, but a flood designed to erase an entire world's history is something with a purpose and a hand behind it. He spent the day viewing the spire as a simple challenge of resource collection, a dead zone full of ancient junk his hands could harvest, but old Marin had just shattered that narrow outlook. Now that's a chilling hint that the dead place was actually no accident. So he filed this knowledge like he did everything else, a dangerous blind spot in his grand strategy game, promising himself he would extract the whole truth from the mysterious old woman whenever she deemed him worthy. Later that night, his secured block began communicating secrets of the sublevel, using the only mechanical voice a revived facility ever knows, the language of active sensors he had brought back online beneath the floor. The restored defense grid watching the plaza read much deeper than he had originally designed, picking up movement below the concourse where his maps showed dead structures. Something stirred slowly below the drowned market that the layers of the spire were supposed to shut off. Sayuan noticed him freeze over the readout. When she asked what was wrong, he told her the truth. Something was moving in a zone the survivor map swore was sealed directly below the block he had just bled so much power to hold. The water kept rising on the concourse, climbing a hand width every single cycle. Just like on the tier above, whatever stirred in the sealed dark below them was the only thing down there moving directly toward him instead of running away. Both of them decided to go down after the threat because a stronghold that cannot tell you what lies beneath its own floor is completely useless. That sealed sublevel sat right below the market, hidden where survivor maps showed nothing. Only closed, dead structures remained. The only way down was a maintenance throat behind the drowned shop fronts that the flood had not yet swallowed. It was a black, wet shaft where the grid picked up movement. They descended together, Sayuan holding the heavy cutting torch he had custom built for her and the breather it fed, while he kept his own blade ready the whole way down. Searching the pitch black for threats before they could strike, Sayuan originally wanted to leave the sublevel sealed, holding the block until the rising water forced their hand, but he told her something that quickly changed her mind. A threat you face on your own terms is always better, and honestly, his logic here is hard to argue with. It would only strike when they were weakest. As a seasoned salvage engineer, she knew the deadly cost of ignoring a reading, so she followed him down. Without another word, his newly restored hand easily found solid grip on the wet stone, something his old, broken hand never could have managed. Descending below his own stronghold was the first time he truly realized the massive scale of this journey. This was not just a single drop down one shaft, but an entire spire of them, with each dark layer hiding something worse beneath, leading all the way to the root. Finally, they reached a flooded service hollow. It was cramped, ancient, and far older than the market above. The very bones of the spire exposed where the newer construction ended. His appraisal eye scanned the area before his feet even touched the ground, finding not a creature but a massive structure, a sealed descent shaft constructed right into the bedrock, heavily capped ages ago by someone who wanted it kept shut. The history of this place rushed into his mind from the rusted metal, showing exactly where the shaft led, deep past the market into the transit tombs. This drowned web of collapsed transit tunnels was incredibly deep and ancient, far more dangerous than anywhere he had gone yet, and now things were getting real. The rising water from below was slowly, patiently forcing the heavy cap open. Standing there, he realized a terrifying truth. The flood was not just rising. It was feeding directly up through the very roots of the spire. Sayuan ran her hand along the ancient cap, listening closely, she warned him that the seal had held longer than either of them had been alive, but was close to breaking. Whatever waited on the other side of that cap was old enough to destroy everything. It was sealed on purpose, still unopened, but something was hiding in the hollow, a hidden cache his eyes had already locked onto. The system buried it deep down here. Above anything he had touched on the concourse, no sane survivor simply walks past. A locked reward to open a worse door first. This cache was ranked brass on the system's ladder, 2 full tiers above the rust and iron junk he had been clearing. All day, brass was where salvaged junk finally became something useful, something that completely changed what a survivor could do. His appraisal eye scanned the contents before he opened the lid, knowing exactly what lay inside before his hands ever confirmed it. Inside lay the first truly massive upgrade that this dead world had ever offered him. A schematic, a restorable plan for an ancient defense construct from a vanished world. The rising water had drowned it, but he could rebuild this warframe from local rubble. Once he gathered enough charge, the system blueprints walked him through what this beast had been before its death, a heavy sentry platform that once guarded this service hollow from intruders. His grid confirmed that if he restored it, a tier above its original peak, the deadly machine would answer absolutely to no one but him. Even better than the blueprints were the 3 cores. Rare salvage cores of the exact grade the system required for deep restorations that he simply could not afford before. To his eyes, each core looked like a dense little knot of ancient power. These were the legendary treasures that old survivor maps marked in red, warning people not to die trying to reach. He held all 3 in his hand. Sion counted them, instantly falling silent. All day, he had felt the hard ceiling of his own power. The absolute cap on how much he could lift per cycle, forcing him to choose exactly to save and what to leave drowned. Honestly, these cores were the ultimate answer. They were exactly what the system used to raise that cap, feeding the first core into his forge. A deep reservoir of pure energy expanded inside his chest. It made room for complex restorations he was too weak to even attempt. Just an hour ago, Sion watched his expression shift as his power level surged. She asked what he had just become, and this time he told her the truth. Since she had earned it, he was no longer just a guy who could fix a block. He was now someone who could build a fortress no flood could drown. She did not laugh or look afraid. She just asked how soon they could use it. That was exactly why she was the only person on this entire spire he trusted. But the relentless rising sea forced their hand before he could finish cataloging his loot. Water in the hollow was rising rapidly while they stood right inside it. It climbed the failing seal from below, driven by the spire's relentless, unbroken cycle. The brutal math was the exact same math that had already chased them off the upper tier. It would eventually drive them off every single layer. Staying put meant drowning. He could hold his restored block for maybe a cycle or 2, but the sea simply did not care how good his walls were. The only direction that was not a trap on this flooded spire was straight down. That sealed shaft in front of them was the single descent route off a layer the flood was already reclaiming. And the ancient seal that had held for an entire generation was failing on its own schedule. He quickly scanned the deep rank board on the network before touching it. Because a truly careful man always learns what happened to those before him. These are the people who went where he is about to go. The descent leaderboard runs deeper than this layer, reaching all the way down to the spire's root and the names on the deep end belonged to survivors who pushed past the layers he knew down into the black water. What the board showed him was something he did not need to say out loud. A great many names had descended past the market into the dark tombs and the levels underneath, and so many of those names had simply stopped posting. Their ranks remained frozen at the last depth the net ever heard from them. The living climbed higher, while the dead stayed exactly where they fell, down. In the tombs, the board was crowded with names that had gone completely silent, a quiet he had learned on the top tier to read as the loudest warning the net could ever give. He told Sion what the board showed because a partner following him into the dark deserves to know the odds first, and she heard it the way she heard everything as cold data, not fear. She told him the concourse was already lost to the flood, but a layer filled with the dead who descended was still ground. She would rather walk into beside the only living survivor who could make those dead things useful. Then she placed her restored hand on the failing seal and asked if they were going to wait for the water to open it or do it themselves. He Had the charge now, the cap raised by the core, the schematic in his blade, and his partner, and there was no version of waiting that did not end in drowning. So he placed his hand on the old cap beside hers and let his appraisal eye read the last of its history. Then he spent the charge to break what a careful generation had sealed. The seal did not so much open as remember how to, the cap, pulling back along seams that had rusted shut decades before the flood, and watch closely, the transit shaft finally opens for the first time since something had worked very hard to lock it tight. Cold, flooded air rushed up out of it, colder than the water around their knees, carrying the smell of a deeper drowning. In the darkness of a layer no light had reached in a generation, he stood over the open shaft with Seong at his side, the breather hissing in her grip, ready to descend into the tombs the moment the air settled. The deep rank board's frozen names still hung in the corner of his eye as a warning to remember. Not a thing to obey, his reed worked the throat below them as far as the dark would let it reach, revealing that the tunnels widened into drowned transit platforms a level down, where the salvage was older and richer than anything the concourse had held, with danger sitting at a grade his eye had no clean word for. Seong asked him what was down there, and he gave her the only honest answer he had, that the board's silent names had all gone quiet at this exact depth, and that whatever took them was still down there waiting for the next foolish ascenders to arrive. She tightened her grip on her torch, saying she would rather face it beside the man who restores than alone. In the dark, he marked that as one more debt he owed her, turning his eye back to the shaft to watch the cold air settle, the first. But get this, the thing rising from the shaft was not air, and it was not silence. Something climbed the dark toward them, slow, wet, and deeply wrong, and his appraisal eye opened on it before it cleared the lip, giving him a reading he could not categorize. It had once been a person, a drowned commuter from the Spire had claimed this transit tomb decades ago, attempting the one thing he thought only he could do. Actually trying to restore the dead back to life, reversing what time had claimed. This broken world had reached deep into a corpse and rebuilt it from the inside out. But it did the work without any real understanding, a truly blind reconstruction. Bone was set into the wrong joints, and flesh closed over a completely wrong shape, creating a creature far more than dead, and yet somehow less than alive. A cruel, clumsy mockery of his own clean work now hauled itself over the shaft lip. This twisted monstrosity was the exact inverse of everything he stood for. A pair of ruined, remade eyes stared up out of the pitch black and locked onto him. The wretched creature dragged its body over the ledge, those hollow eyes still fixed on him. He did the only logical thing when a reconstructed corpse decides he looks like easy prey. And when it prepared to tear him apart, he immediately activated his appraisal skill. His appraisal eye laid bare its entire tragic history in the fraction of a second before it lunged. The drowning decades ago, and the long, slow descent through the cold silt below. Sinking deep into the transit platform before the blind hand of this broken world reached down. Rebuilding it clumsily, a far cry from the clean work his own hands usually did. The reading revealed that the joints had been set completely wrong, purely by mindless accident. While the strength in those remade arms was real, the actual physical structure was a lie. But his eye gave him the one crucial advantage he always looked for: the weak point. A thin seam where the rebuilt flesh had closed over the wrong bone and never fused. It sat right under the left shoulder, a massive fault line in this poorly constructed shell. Built by something that had absolutely no idea what a human body was meant to do. He did not fight it directly. Instead, Sion swept her restored torch through the darkness, forcing the creature's ruined eyes to instinctively snap toward the sudden flash of light. Utilizing that split second, he slipped right inside its reach and drove his weapon home, thrusting his restored salvage blade straight through that unhealed shoulder seam. A gap this broken world had never closed, the blade slid in flawlessly, incredibly smooth. He had personally restored this weapon way past its original peak just 2 cycles prior. Now a physical fault line that had held for decades instantly began to tear apart. With its structural weakness exposed and cut open, the resurrected commuter completely collapsed. It folded right over the edge of the shaft, finally becoming completely still. He crouched down, scanning what remained of the corpse before the dark water swept it away. The chilling information he uncovered weighed far heavier on him than any pride in surviving. Nestled deep inside was a core, but not the clean variety he usually salvaged. This was a highly corrupted power source, specifically grown inside the dead tissue. It existed solely to power a dark resurrection that never should have been attempted. His appraisal identified it as the core engine driving this entire unnatural aberration. The very force forcing drowned corpses upright to hunt and claw at the living. Beneath that lay one final detail, something that would haunt him for days to come. The severed, corrupted core was not just sitting lifelessly inside the ruined flesh. It was actively being pulled by a faint, constant magnetic draw toward the abyss, guiding it straight down into the pitch-black depths waiting far below them. Like water finding the absolute lowest seam in a broken ship and rushing down. Whatever this twisted place was doing to the dead, it was gathering them somewhere. And so they began their descent down the freezing, flooded transit shaft. The descent through the hollow spire dragged on forever until it finally opened into the actual tombs. This place was no lively market, nor was it a quick loot run. Nothing from the concourse had prepared him for this. They found a flooded transit station as massive as an entire district, platforms stacked 3. Deep in pitch-black water, rusting transit cars still sat on their dead rails. Their doors wide open, frozen exactly as they were the day the deluge hit. The salvage here was far older and richer than anything above. His gaze confirmed it instantly, intact pre-flood machine cores and sealed. Cabling lay perfectly preserved in the freezing cold, frozen all over the platforms were the belongings people clung to when the sudden waters struck. Satchels still dangled from a hook, a child's shoe remained wedged in a grate, and fair tokens lay fused to the metal turnstile by decades of ice, none of it had been disturbed since that fatal morning, a hub built for 10,000 commuters an hour was now dead silent, but beneath this frozen graveyard, a dark force was actively reaching into the corpses to force them upright, and the dead were absolutely everywhere. Not all of them were walking yet, as most remained drowned. In the dark, they rested inside cars and across platforms where the flood waters had washed them a generation ago, yet a terrifying handful of them had been stitched back together, just like the horror that climbed the shaft earlier. Those ones were moving. His system tagged them as he picked his way along the platform, with Sayun keeping watch at his back, and honestly, every single scan was bad news, wrong. Rebuilt bodies, corrupted cores, and structural weak points along their unsealed seams. Some had limbs grafted in bizarre, unnatural places. One had clearly been a transit guard, wearing a tattered, rotting uniform over a body forcefully reshaped into a horrific monster. The fabric stretched unnaturally. The creatures slowly turned toward them as they passed, their reconstructed eyes locking onto their torchlight. He realized right away that this level was not a place to conquer. They could only slip through before getting noticed. This deadly crossing taught him the rules of the deep, one abomination at a time. Creature rebuilt by this corrupted world did not possess any normal living malice. Nor did it hesitate. It feared no blade, no fire, and had no survival instinct. It simply locked onto the nearest living target, moving forward in a slow, relentless line. Unfazed by wounds that would immediately kill any living human being, continuing its pursuit. Because the decaying core in its chest did not care if the vessel was ruined. His eyes quickly learned to evaluate them instantly, separating the ones whose grafts made them highly dangerous from the failures that could barely stand. Sayun quickly learned to trust his judgment, targeting the ones he designated weak. While leaving him the tougher threats, they pushed forward along the narrow platform. In perfect synchronization, his gaze sorting the monsters while her sword cleared the easy targets, leaving him to butcher the rest. Their deadly coordination held beautifully. Because they never paused, refusing to let a single creature slip behind them. But the absolute worst threats were the creations left half-finished. A fully rebuilt creature was at least predictable, a corrupted core inside a functioning body with clear weak points. But these platforms held half-formed monstrosities that had been discarded mid-process. A single torso dragged itself forward with one functional arm, while its lower half remained buried in the silt. Severed heads tracked their light on raw, open necks. Creatures caught between being drowned and risen, things that never should have even moved but did anyway. His eyes saw them as a glitched restoration, only partially installed. And that observation taught him what no manual could ever fully explain. The unseen hand driving this horrific restoration was acting without any real mind behind it. It was a blind reflex forcing bodies up, regardless of what they could actually do. Once they hit the floor, he instantly checked the database for local records. A cautious survivor always maps out the dark thoroughly, before stepping straight into the unknown. The dive rankings on the console ran incredibly deep, far past the upper layers. In the bottom of that list was a graveyard filled with frozen player names. They had braved the lower tombs below, then silence, their signals completely cut out. Right at the exact depth where his boots now rested, a death tracker ticked nearby. It displayed the system count of everyone claimed by this spire since the awakening. At this exact depth, the casualty numbers were ticking up faster than on any upper floor. Next to the board, a frantic player chat scrolled by. They were pleading with people to turn back, screaming one universal warning. It was the one rule everyone in these deep layers agreed on: do not get surrounded. And never, under any circumstance, follow them if they decide to walk away. He noted that warning immediately, knowing it would become vital very soon. Beside him, Su Yan scanned the ruined platform with lightning speed, processing everything in seconds. She was the first to speak aloud the exact mystery his mind had been circling. She pointed out that the wandering corpses were all heading in the exact same direction. Unless they actively attacked, they marched forward like clockwork. He closely watched the next pack. She was right, a glitched group that had ignored their lights suddenly turned. They moved as one, shuffling toward the absolute edge of the lowest deck. Leaving the platform, they headed straight down a service staircase into the dark. They marched the exact same way that first corrupted core had been drawn, straight down. A pull, something at the very bottom, was calling them all back home. Something dark under the spire was reeling in its grim harvest. And every corrupted core he analyzed on the way down pointed toward that single location. He crouched down at the edge of the highest platform to think. With the freezing air blowing over the dark water, he assembled the puzzle. The truth was falling into place inside the only shelter his mind truly trusted anymore. His own mind. This shattered world was auto-restoring its dead, but doing it wrong. That fundamental glitch birthed a corrupted core, and those cores were being pulled down. They were all heading straight to the root, but his own forge worked entirely differently. His forge restored cleanly what the system rebuilt with pure, unthinking cruelty. The process required a mind that actually understood what it was putting back together. But whatever lurked at the bottom of this place was the ultimate opposite of life. It had been harvesting this sunken world for an entire generation, pulling cores down. No name yet, he had none for this terrifying anomaly, but he knew the direction. What he did have was a clear direction. The dead were marching toward it. Every fallen survivor on that console had walked toward it, following the call. The only escape route ran along the exact same path all those dead souls took. Into a darkness where something had been shredding souls since long before they awoke. He stood telling Sion they were following the dead, as it was their only escape. A safe spot on a spire feeding downward sat right in front of the source, not behind it. Next, he scanned the service stairs the dead had used and led the way down. The stairs opened up onto a flooded interchange 2 levels under the station. That was where he heard a living voice for the first time since leaving the concourse. Someone was cursing in it. Language he did not recognize from inside a collapsed shaft half drowned in Blackwater. His specialized vision located her before his flashlight beam even could. She was wedged deep inside a flooded maintenance shaft with a dead dive rig on her back. The air inside her rig was long gone. The only reason she was still breathing was a coffin-sized pocket of trapped air that the rising water was slowly swallowing up. 1 small inch at a time, his scanning ability revealed her entire desperate struggle in a single glance, a dive that went too deep, and a rig that failed at the worst possible depth imaginable. On top of that, a shaft collapsed behind her, leaving her trapped to slowly drown. With a clear view of the exit she could never reach, he could have abandoned her. Let's be real, in a place like this, saving a stranger is usually a death sentence. Saving Lena Crow would cost him precious energy and create another mouth to feed. But the advanced diving gear strapped to her back completely changed his survival math. His specialized vision identified the dive rig as the absolute best salvage he had ever found. A rare pre-flood breather built for extreme depths, it was completely ruined now. But ruined in ways he could easily fix, a man with the power to restore things never leaves the best breathing rig to rot just because the diver inside is inconvenient. So he ordered Siang to brace the opening of the shaft immediately. He reached through the freezing water, placing his hand on the dead rig to analyze its final broken seal before spending his energy. The restoration process took the breather far beyond its original state. Its cracked oxygen tank suddenly mended itself, and the Spent filter came back ready to clean air it was never designed for. Then, the faulty regulator that almost killed her upgraded to premium pre-flood standards. He felt a heavy sink in his chest as his power drained away rapidly. That was the massive cost of a major restoration, but then the dive gear. On her back hissed to life, pumping fresh air through a mask designed for a different face entirely. She breathed. The first thing she did with that fresh air was grin right at him through the murky water of the flooded shaft. She had just been dying moments ago. That cheeky grin revealed everything he needed to understand about Lena Crow before she even uttered a single intelligible word. They pulled her out together, and she emerged coughing and laughing at the same time. A wiry foreign girl with rough, scarred hands, sporting a reckless grin that ignored the extreme danger she was in. She looked happily at the upgraded gear, then at him, then back to the rig, realizing by touch that the machine on her had actually become superior to when it was built. Once she gathered enough English to speak, she asked what he did, and he explained the simple truth of his restoration power. It was his only real gift in this place. The harsh spire would allow him to keep nothing else. Surprisingly, there was no scoffing or laughter in her eyes. Instead, she gently placed her rough hand flat against the restored tank, feeling its incredible quality, and declared that a man who could fix ruined gear like this was someone she would gladly dive for forever. One of them finally killed her. It was a fate the deep net boards predicted. Her lifespan was expected to be short. He marked her as the third person worth keeping at his back, putting her in front where a diver belongs. She earned that spot within the hour. Lena plunged into deep water. He could not follow her, and she returned with a map of the interchange in her head, every flooded passage, every drowned car, every deeper drop, and she found the exact thing in the wreckage that turned the next layer from pure survival into something far greater. She surfaced in the middle of a collapsed transit junction, shook the water off, and told him there was a dead machine down there, too big to salvage but too intact to leave, half buried under a fallen rail gantry where the flood pinned it long ago. He went down to read it himself because some things cannot be taken on a scout's word. What his eye opened on at the bottom of that junction changed the entire shape of the descent for him. It was a transit war drone. The old city built them to hold transit lines during those final bad years before the flood, a squat armored machine on tread rings with a sharp cutting arm and a hardened core. It had been dead for a generation under the water. That killed it, but dead in the specific way only machines die, which is to say, nothing close to how a person dies. A machine that has simply stopped is just a machine waiting for someone to understand it. His appraisal eye read the or drone down to the last seized bearing and corroded line, telling him three things. The drone was repairable, and a restore would bring it back a grade above the day the city fielded it. His men forge held one more function he had carried since the wake, without ever finding a worthy thing to spend it on. There was a bind in the men forge, letting him claim what he restored, bringing a stalled machine back better than new to make it his. He spent 2 cycles of charge on that drone, counting it the best trade he had made. Since the spire woke, the restore knit the seized treads loose and brought the cutting arm back to an edge no pre-flood blade had held, while the hardened core came up rated for a load the city's engineers would have called impossible. When the work was finished, he laid the bind into it as the men forge had shown him, a thread run from his own reservoir into the drone's restored core, and it came online under his hand. The thing the flood killed a generation back finally rose up out of the silt of the junction on restored treads, turned its cutting arm toward him, waiting for an order because it was his now, the first restored unit he had ever fielded. It was graded far above anything else on this layer. Suyin watched the drone stand and voiced the quiet thought he had been harboring, that everyone else on this spire fought the wrong restored dead with their bare hands and salvage blades, losing a little of themselves every single time, while he had turned the layer's own dead machines into something that fought for him. And honestly, that was absolute genius. The tombs were full of dead. The dead included dead machines, and where every other descender saw the war drones as just another hazard in the dark, he saw a standing army the flood had pre-killed, leaving only one man on the spire who could bring it back. Lena put her grin on the drone, asking how many more of these were down here. His eye had already counted. There were many. They met the survivor group at the edge of the platform. Stand 4 desperate descenders who arrived from the Concourse a cycle early, surviving this far on sheer grit and rusty blades. They stare at him with the same old concourse judgment, a thin repair tech. With zero obvious strength, only a clanking scrap drone follows him, their leader. Heavyset man with a salvage spear holds a lower rank but ignores it. Telling him to keep his trash far away from his people, he mocks him, asking what a guy with a broken toaster plans to do when monsters rise. He says absolutely nothing. Instead, the dark tombs answer for him right then. Suddenly, the dead swarm the platform while the leader is still talking. A wrong restored pack crawls over the lip of the lower platform, 6 of them. The absolute worst kind, turning back toward the warm living things above. The nervous survivor group instantly readies their rusty spears, preparing to die. 4 terrified people facing 6 creatures that feel absolutely no pain. He gives his clanking drone a single order. It launches off the edge. It drops directly into the swarm, leading with its razor-sharp cutting arm. A restored pre-flood war drone, operating well past its peak limit. What it does to 6 mindless corpses is not a fight at all. It is a swift sorting. The blade easily finds every single weak seam. His trained eyes had mapped their weak points. The drone finishes them off instantly. The leader could not even lower his useless spear before they all fell. The drone rolls back to his heel, wiping silt off its blade, waiting quietly. But there is absolutely nothing left to cut. Meanwhile, a survivor has been online. He was betting in the chat on how fast they would dismantle it. He watches the bet scroll past while the machine cleans its arm. The group chat only gave the treaded toaster a 6-second count. They expected it to get torn apart, but the machine took far less time than that. The entire pack is completely down, and the active chat goes dead silent. That is how people freeze when the junk they mocked saves them. They realize the scrap drone just kept them alive, and the tone immediately shifts. Everyone starts carefully asking who this restorer is and if he is recruiting. After that performance, the heavyset leader stops calling it a broken toaster. He stares at the 6 ruined bodies his men almost died fighting. All of them are completely slaughtered, while his own team remains entirely untouched. He looks at the scrap drone, sitting quietly at the repairman's heel. He finally does the simple math that the concourse teaches too late. You do not measure a restorer by what he carries, but by what he creates. With a lot less attitude in his voice, he asks if they are heading further down. He wonders if his group can walk where the drone walks. He is told the price he always charges, and the man agrees. No arguments, those are the only followers worth having in this place. They push on, moving into a dead maintenance bay far below the platform. It is the deepest dry room left in the entire ruined interchange. That is where Lena's scout light catches something totally unexpected. A pre-flood terminal sits against the far wall, a hidden station. It once managed this whole layer, but has been dark for ages. An ancient terminal sits frozen, its dead gray screen fogged over by the biting cold. It should have been just another relic in this tomb, but Lena's light suddenly sweeps over it. Suddenly, the glass flickers once, just a dying spark inside the machine. This machine has held onto its last breath of power since long before they were born. Then a single line of ancient text ghosts across the dark glass. But his unique eyes analyze the terminal before he even steps forward to touch it. The device is repairable. Whatever secrets it was built to record are still locked inside. Trapped deep within a dying battery, the data waits for someone who can bring it back. He presses his palm flat against the freezing glass, reading its system down to the last cell. Without hesitating, he channels his own energy to force the ancient machine back to life. Under his touch, the terminal boots up even stronger than the day it was built. The display glows bright and clear, casting sharp light into the dark maintenance bay. A room that has not seen a single speck of light for an entire generation. It had been clutching its final record like a drowning victim holding its breath. Now that he has restored its power, the terminal reveals its secrets to the group. An old maintenance log plays across the screen, dating back to the days before the flood. It shows an engineer detailing the status of this very sector for a doomed city. A city that would be completely submerged long before anyone could ever read his words. He expected a routine technical report, but instead, he gets the truth about the end. It is the first real explanation he has ever found of how this world ended. The voice recounts stories of the unmakers, things that seemed impossible to believe. The recording claims that the sinking of the drowned spire was no mere accident. Instead, it was a deliberate choice. A terrifying force from the pre-flood city had reached the spire and actively begun the process of tearing it completely apart. Vital seals failed without explanation. Heavy machinery simply came undone for no reason. Even worse, the city's deceased refused to rest, rising up from their graves. One terrifying word appears in every single entry to describe what was happening. That word is unmaking, the literal undoing of creation itself. And this process has a path. Everything touched by it is dragged downward, pulled directly toward the roots of the spire, straight into a nameless abyss. The log cuts off abruptly as the engineer runs out of time or power. Immediately, the glowing display goes dark, leaving the four of them in silence. Only the freezing cold remains, along with a word they all fear, but they are not alone. He has known old Marin was stalking them since the service stairs. She is a half-blind veteran salvager who warned him that this place remembers its past. Keeping her distance in the shadows, she refused to step into the light. Now she slips into the bay while the log plays, and he watches her face closely. You always learn more from watching who flinches than from the recording itself. The sight of rotting corpses does not bother her. She has seen far worse. But hearing that single word, unmaking, seems to age her on the spot. Her good eye stares at the restored paint, filled with the raw dread of someone awaiting their undoing. Her good eye locks onto the glowing console with the absolute horror of someone who spent her entire life hoping that word was just an old myth. When he asks what she knows about it, she tells him absolutely nothing, but from her. That complete silence is the loudest answer possible as she turns her face away. Like two halves of a hidden truth that someone had desperately tried to drown, there was a small detail she showed before turning away that he remembered. Her good eye shifted from the restored paint to his hands, the very hands that just woke a dead machine and dragged its final truth out of the cold. The dread aging her face gray was not just from the text on screen, some of it was for him, and honestly he had long since learned to recognize the exact second people stopped seeing him as a useful stranger and began viewing him as a key piece of a story they already knew. He read that realization on old Marin's face, clear as a posted rank. She had heard the unmaking named, looking directly at the sole survivor on the spire, whose unique talent was the exact opposite of it, putting the pieces together. Hours before he would even let himself speak the same thought out loud, whatever she knew, she clearly knew where he fit in. She just was not ready to be the one who told him he was not foolish enough to press a half-blind veteran who had survived this long on the strength of the things she chose to keep hidden. He put the rest together himself, sitting quiet in the cold bay while Lena watched the darkness. And Suyeon watched Marin. The world tried to restore its dead but did it wrong. Growing corrupted cores that were pulled downward toward the root of the spire. Pre-flood engineer had named the force behind this the Unmakers, calling their destruction the reverse of restoration. His mind forged the connection with clear understanding. The blind, cruel unmaking was the direct opposite of his power, restoration. This meant the incredible talent the system gave him was the exact opposite of whatever had drowned this world. That was no comfort. Nobody survives a massive flood by standing as its opposite. You survive by being useful to those around you and deadly to your enemies. So he shut down the thought, filed it away, and spoke to absolutely no one but Suyeon, a truth that massive is something you carry silently until you know the price of laying it down. Then he went right back to being useful. Dread is a luxury, but maintaining a stronghold is not. This bay was the deepest dry room in the transit layer, a defensible fortress, with one wide entry and a ceiling that had held back decades of water, without ever failing, and someone who just learned the world is being deliberately destroyed does not just stand in the dark and brood. No, he builds walls. Using the raw charge he had stored, he activated another stronghold restore in the bay just as he had raised the first one. The failed bulkhead doors repaired themselves far past their original limits. The cracked ceiling braces knit whole, while the bay's ancient power lines and conduits sparked to life under his hand. Dead maintenance station became a stronghold the rising water would struggle to reclaim. He deployed the drone at the main entrance and sent Lena into the water to scout the paths below. Meanwhile, Seong managed the vital salvage line feeding them. Just like she did before, he armed his allies using the layer's own dead. These ancient tombs held salvage far richer than anything on the upper levels. Pre-flood gear the descendants above lacked the talent to recover. He went through Everything with the cold focus of a man sorting an abandoned, unclaimed fortune. 4. Sayang, he fully restored a defensive vest, making it completely impervious to weapons. Lena received a pre-flood cutting tool that possessed an impossibly sharp edge. Far beyond any normal dive knife. Finally, he salvaged cores from 3 dead. He used the machines to raise his cap, making restores faster and costing him less energy. Less of himself each time. The refugees whom the heavyset man brought also got restored salvage too, because a holding is only as strong as its weakest hand. And anyone who arms his people from the surrounding dead will never run short of weapons. By the end of his watch, the bay had become a major transit stronghold, the second he had raised on the descent, and the people inside were carrying gear a grade above anything the upper layer had ever fielded. He checked the network before letting himself rest, following his usual routine, and the network was where the next threat found him. The descent ranking board had pushed him up because his clean restores in the tombs had registered within the system, just like combat kills did for everyone else, and the board now ranked him well within the top 30 of the entire descent, a simple junk man, sitting above elite swordsmen and brawlers who had brutally fought their way down. That should have been a quiet victory, but as you probably guessed, the scrolling survivor chat beside the board had started mentioning his holding, and that name was being repeated by the wrong crowd. He went through the logs like he did everything fast and thoroughly, quickly sorting the begging from the hunting. Most of it was standard tomb chatter, with descendants trading news about rising water levels and the mounting dead. A handful of them begged for directions to any holding offering shelter before the flood claimed the next platform. Beneath that ran a thinner, far more patient thread. 3 or 4 accounts that asked absolutely nothing about shelter and everything about his specific location, the strength of his walls, his drone count, the exact questions a buyer asks before a raid, never before a rescue. The death counter kept ticking, displaying the system's running tally of everyone whom the massive spire had swallowed since the wake, a number climbing steadily at this deep layer. Enough that a cautious survivor learned to treat it like a ticking clock. He had maybe 1 watch left before those patient accounts stopped asking and started arriving. The only valuable way to spend that time was building, so he built. By then, the chat had caught on to his activities, word of a master restorer who raised strongholds from dead salvage and deployed working war drones had quickly climbed back up the network to the upper layers. Not everyone reading it was a desperate descender looking for a wall to hide behind. The intact gear trade on those upper layers relied entirely on scarcity and the reality that working pre-flood gear could no longer be manufactured. It could only be hoarded, and a man who could turn scrap into gear far better than intact relics was no mere curiosity to the power players who held that monopoly. He was a direct threat to their entire fortune. He read the names in the chat, asking very politely for the exact location where the restorer had established his holding, tracing exactly who those accounts actually answered to. The trail led directly to the single city state on the spire with the absolute most to lose, and just like that, Bryanhold was on their way to wipe him out. Long before any physical scout could, the descent ranking board lighting up with a cluster of names moving rapidly down the layers in tight formation, a sponsored army descending fast and direct toward the transit tombs, aiming for the exact coordinates those polite accounts had been fishing for all along. Bryanhold controlled the largest stash of pre-flood technology on the spire, building their entire power base on the scarcity of those relics. An economy making their hoard worthless was an existential threat. It was something they would gladly sacrifice lives to strangle right in its cradle. This was not a peaceful descent. They wanted the workshop and the man threatening their monopoly. They needed to stop him before their own power became completely worthless. The frozen graveyard of forgotten names down below was absolute proof of their ruthlessness. Nobody on this spire moved down in tight formation unless they came to conquer. He tracked the incoming squad, reading their numbers and gear from his monitor. He stood up inside his restored holding, locking away that heavy dread for later. A much closer, bloodier fight was already marching down the layers straight toward him. When Suyin asked what the screens showed, he told her the brutal truth. A Brynhold strike team was coming to seize the facility and capture the restorer. They wanted to crush him before his new technology could truly threaten their grip. The enemy would reach the transit bay within the hour, but she never suggested running. Instead, she asked how many soldiers there were and how quickly he could mobilize. She wanted to know how soon he could make the dead machines rise. His bay had only one entrance, a junk pile of dead machines waiting for his spark. He possessed a unique talent for turning absolute trash into terrifying weapons of war. Soon, the Breinhold force marched up the main path, 24 soldiers in perfect formation. They wore matching, high-grade armor, the kind of heavy squad meant to end fights instantly. They carried intact pre-flood weapons, the foundation of their faction's dominance. These heavily hoarded relics allowed them to move with total, unchecked confidence. Honestly, they walked like men who had never faced an obstacle they could not destroy. He watched their arrogant approach from behind his newly reinforced metal bulkhead. With Su Yin by his side, he did not even reach for a rifle. Fighting a massive war column head-on was the last thing a smart engineer would do. His talent was not brute strength, it was reading his enemies, letting setups do the work. Suddenly, his appraisal eye flared to life, scanning the entire enemy formation instantly. It mapped out every single raider, exposing every critical weakness down to the seams. The lead breacher's seemingly perfect shield had a tiny, hidden crack along the bottom edge. Their own expert smiths had completely missed it, over on the left, a sniper. He favored a bad knee that would buckle the second he tried to shift positions. 3 of those expensive power suits had cheap salvage patches hiding at the joints. A fatal structural flaw the confident soldiers did not even realize they carried. Meanwhile, the arrogant captain at the rear led them with fragile, unearned pride. That false pride would shatter the very second things stopped going his way. He did not need to be stronger, he just needed to know exactly where they broke. His eye gave him 24 answers before the first soldier ever touched his trap grid. Then the floor exploded. He had upgraded the old power conduit far beyond its limits. It was a level of voltage the old transit authority could never handle. That leading breacher with the cracked shield stepped directly onto a newly activated metal plate. The restored power line dumped a massive pre-flood shock right through his gear. His heavy armor was never rated to block that, and he collapsed instantly. The enemy vanguard fell at the doorstep without his allies ever firing a shot. That sudden pause, the very first crack in their perfect armor of confidence. It was the exact split-second opening he needed. He finally barked his waiting order. Soha unleashed her fury from there, and that was when he realized what he created. Sheltering inside his own holding, she had traveled down with the refugees, an ex-soldier who had lost her entire squad on an upper layer and stayed quiet about it. He had marked her as just another mouth to feed until the attackers hit his approach, and something in her woke up. Without being asked, she put herself at the head of his restored drones and armed refugees. She read the broken column. In a single glance, the way only someone holding a line before could, and started giving orders that turned a holding full of frightened salvagers into a fighting line. He had built the walls, but Soha made them fight. She set the war drones where the raiders would have to funnel, putting the refugees with their restored gear behind the second bulkhead where their weak hands were covered, and held the entire defense plan in her head while the Breinhold captain was still trying to understand why his easy raids stopped moving. Talk about a total shutdown. The column broke against a wall he never could have planned. Soha sent the bound war drone into the funnel, and the cutting arm found the salvage patch joints his eye had flagged. 3 match suits ripped open at the exact seam their wearers had trusted, and the marksman with the bad knee folded the moment Soha forced him off his mark. Refugees the concourse had written off held the second bulkhead with restored gear, a grade above anything Breinhold carried, and every place the raiders pushed they found a wall that pushed back harder than any had a right to. Their captain spent his confidence in the manner of a leaking hold losing its air fast and all at once, and within the watch the matched column sent to take his workshop was a knot of broken raiders trying to get back up the approach they had walked down so easily. Back Neon kept them whole through the worst of it. She was a medic, a chem salvager, another refugee he had armed without knowing what he had, and when the first of his people went down under an intact Breinhold blade, she was already there with a kit of restored medicine that worked a full grade above anything the pre-flood pharmacies had. Bottled, he had restored a case of drowned medical salvage 2 watches before without thinking past the value of it, and Neon turned that case into the reason the line did not bleed out. She moved through the holding under the fighting, pulled the wounded behind the bulkhead, and put them back together. With restored compounds that closed wounds the raiders had opened to kill. By the end, she had not lost one of his, a holding that loses no one is. A holding that wins twice, because every hand she saved was a hand still holding. While he learned who they really were in that single watch, which is the only way to ever truly learn anyone by seeing what they do when the wall is tested, so she had spent the time since the wake making herself small, a woman who had watched her squad die on an upper layer and decided the safest thing left was to be no one worth following. The raid burned that off her in a few breaths, she read. His restored funnel and his bound drone and his frightened refugees, and she made them into a defense that held, and when it was over, she did not ask for thanks or a share, only for whatever gear he could spare so she would be ready the next time a wall of his was tested. Neon was the opposite kind of quiet. Chem salvager who had kept her head down because a medic who looks useful gets hoarded by every faction on this spire. She showed him her real worth by spending. He kept working right through the battle, letting his defenders take all the credit. All she asked was whether he would keep fixing the junk that saved them. It kept his people breathing, so he gave them his usual promise. If they proved themselves, they would always have a permanent place right at his back. He meant every word. When a man builds power from dead scraps, he learns that reliable people are the one thing he cannot replace. They are worth more than any power core. Then came the real shocker. Something the High City would never believe, but he had planned this all along. As the enemy column broke, he told his people to strip the bodies. They stripped the downed raiders of the high-tech gear that built the city. The legendary city built its power on this gear, and he restored it instantly. Intact shields, power suits, and blades. The gear Brynhold treated as ultimate luxury came to life under his hands. Every piece was upgraded a full tier before he handed them straight to the refugees. The same desperate people the Brynhold raiders had dismissed as trash just hours ago. His followers armed themselves from the fallen soldiers who came to slaughter them. Every single weapon actually grew stronger. The local network immediately caught wind of it. Online chat rooms had spent the day betting on his swift demise. They expected Brynhold to crush the junk man. Suddenly, they all went silent. The mood turned ugly, then flipped completely, as the internet always does. The players who once laughed at a mere restorer holding the gate were now begging for shelter, desperate to join his growing base. They wanted to know if this legendary builder had room for them. He literally outgeared the city using their own garbage. Then, his ranking shifted. The system registered his flawless defense just as highly as a massive slaughter. A simple junk man, whom the upper layer elites had written off hours ago, was now ranked higher than the city-state that tried to erase him. He let the online chats do all the boasting, because bragging usually gets you killed. Besides, the global network was already doing plenty of loud boasting on his behalf. Only one raider lived, the captain pinned under a heavy pillar. His confidence shattered, his appraisal charm still blinked, showing his target stats. He scanned the base while refugees stripped his dead squad, his face paled. He was finally doing the terrifying math. The screen revealed the impossible truth. Every wall around them was fully restored, even the broken guard drone was now working better than the day it rolled off the line. High-tier weapons, now arming the refugees, were originally his own. They were upgraded far beyond anything inside the city vault of Brynhold. He brought elite gear to steal a workshop, but got totally outmatched. The junk man outgeared a whole city using their own trash. It hit him. The absolute realization hit him like a brick. Their precious monopoly was dead. High prices meant nothing against a man who could revive dead tech. He had sacrificed an entire elite army just to test the wrong target. He taught this builder exactly how weak the city's defenses actually were. They were beats. The remaining raiders broke and ran in pure panic. They dragged their captain away, leaving all their valuable gear behind. Sioha let the retreating enemies go. She knew that chasing a broken foe into an unfamiliar, flooded layer only leads to a massive loss of lives. And she refused to lose a single person. The outpost stood strong, and his walls had held. His defensive drone had carved them up. His refugees were armed and ready. Far better than the invading forces, he now had a defense captain and a medic he could fully trust. By every important metric, he had won cleanly and decisively, but that victory was exactly what made him uneasy. It was too easy. He stood in the bay, watching the broken enemy flee while the loot piled up, yet the longer he stared at the battlefield, the more wrong it felt. He had to analyze it using the only tool he trusted, his appraisal eye. Under its light, the details of the entire battle began to unfold once more. Their gear, their battle formation, and how easily they threw themselves away. None of it matched up. A powerful city looking to eliminate a threat would send their elite forces to guarantee a kill. This vanguard had marched in good order with matching gear, but his eye detected no elite warriors or city killers. There was nothing here that Brynhold would actually miss. They pressed hard enough to seem genuine, but they folded quickly to cost the enemy city almost nothing. A force that fights merely to look like an attack without trying to win is no raid. It is a distraction, somewhere, while he spent his time securing a victory. In a battle Brynhold did not care about, their true target was being achieved. The network soon revealed what this diversion had bought them, even before scouts could report. The system death counter, tracking those claimed by the spire, suddenly spiked while he stood in the bay, analyzing the retreating column. It was not the typical, slow rise from a few descenders meeting a bad end. The count surged drastically, the way it does when an entire layer drowns instantly. Numbers climbed rapidly, meaning dozens of victims were drowning somewhere at once. The community chat quickly shifted from mocking Brynhold to absolute panic. Everyone was screaming about the transit seals. Someone had opened them, while he won a minor skirmish. An enemy had slipped behind him to unlock the floodgates. The entire layer was drowning. It was the work of the flood-worshipping cult, whispered about in the deep forums, zealots who served the rising waters. Rather than resisting them, they had used the Brynhold raid as a smokescreen. They drew everyone's attention away while executing their real, devastating plot, his appraisal. I scanned the base seals immediately, and the readout filled him with dread. His secure holding was now a death trap, the descent shaft behind his fortress, which was the only escape route from this level, had been welded shut. From the outside, while he was distracted at the front, the layer's flood seals had been ruptured and water was already rising up the lower platforms. That crazy cult had never intended to fight him. Their only goal was to drown him inside the very fortress he built, blocking his only exit. The very walls he was so proud of were now trapping him. He pieced the entire scheme together as the death count climbed. The raid was just a feint to draw his forces to the front gates, while Sioha was busy breaking. Their vanguard, the Saltbone cultists, had slipped around back to finish their task. They locked his escape hatch and opened the entire layer to the crushing ocean. Within a single watch, the entire tomb complex would be underwater, every dry room he had restored, every wall he had raised, and every trap he had triggered would be drowned. Just like the concourse before, the very people he had armed would drown right alongside them. Unless he found another way down faster than the rising water could catch them, there was only one. His eyes had spotted it several watches ago, a problem left for later, and later had just arrived. He recognized their handiwork immediately without even spotting a single cultist. Because that kind of destruction signs itself, the Saltbone did not loot, hold walls, or trade on the net. They sealed off routes, opened old seals, and every place they touched headed straight where the corrupted cores went, down toward the deep, directly toward whatever sat at the spire's root, collecting the drowned, standing inside his doomed holding. As the counter climbed, he finally understood for the first time that the cult, the wrongly restored dead, and the strange pull he felt in that first corrupted core were all the same hand at work, hurrying the entire world's unmaking along. This flood was not a disaster the Saltbone merely endured. It was something they actively served. The old engineer's term fit these flood servants quite cleanly. Just as it fit the dead, he quickly filed that away and spent no more of his precious watch on it, because a man learns his enemy's nature on his own time and survives a flood on the flood's terms. The sealed biovault shaft, Lena had scouted it during their first sweep of this layer, finding a second descent route on the opposite side of the flooding platforms. It was sealed by a pre-flood lock she could not breach, and he had not yet bothered to decipher. It went down past the tombs toward the next deep layer, the only door left that the Saltbone had not yet welded completely shut behind them, likely because they never expected him to find a second route, or they lacked the manpower to seal them both. The rising water made the decision for him, just as it had decided every single move he had made since waking up. Staying meant drowning inside a steel holding with one sealed door. This shaft was their escape, and the flood was already counting down the watches he had to reach it. He gave his orders the way he always did, fast and absolute, without wasting time on the part of him that did not want to abandon a holding he had bled to build. Sioha got the column moving immediately. His people, the refugees, and all the gear they could carry quickly formed up behind the restored war drone, driving hard for the far platforms before the water reached. Hit the second bulkhead, Neon ushered the wounded into the center of the column where the heavy gear protected them. Lena rushed ahead into the climbing water to hold the biovault open, scouting a clean path through flooding platforms that were filling up faster than he had watches left to cross them. Seong ran right beside him, carrying the precious salvage, the glowing cores and the energy charge he would need at the bottom, since reaching the next door with absolutely nothing left. To open it only changes where a man drowns, and honestly, they did not walk. Walking was for people the water had not caught. They drove, he had restored the old transit cars on the dead rails 2 watches ago without any clear purpose, just rusted, drowned machines that had sat with their doors wide open since the very morning of the drowning. Now he spent his last banked charge bringing their nearest line of them past their peak capacity, motors that had not turned in a generation roared to life under his touch, running on rails he restored ahead of them. His people piled onto the shaking transit cars while the dark sea climbed the platforms. Behind them, the train slowly pulled out of his drowning stronghold on its own. Power was restored, driving them along the dead rails toward the tomb's far side. With rising water licking the back wheels, the holding he built went under. Under in their wake, he did not look back, knowing holdings can always be rebuilt. And any moment spent mourning is just another second for the tide to take you. That drive was the worst stretch of the descent, and not because of the water. The wrong restored dead were right there in the floodwaters with them. Opening those seals did more than drown the layer, it unleashed a terrifying tide. It ripped every drowned thing off the platforms, carrying them away in the current. A generation worth of corpses raised by this world suddenly came loose all at once. They slammed hard against the moving train cars, surfacing directly in the headlights. Drifting across the tracks ahead, they reached up out of the climbing darkness. Remade hands clawed toward their warm light, holding on tight. Sioha worked the drone. Operating it off the rear car, she sliced away the corpses grabbing onto the train. Meanwhile, Lena charged ahead through the current, clearing the rails of piled bodies. He focused his gaze, sorting the dead in the headlights faster than ever. He immediately marked which closed targets to plow through and which to avoid, and which open ones had to be cut down. The train ran the gauntlet. Pushing forward one span of rail at a time, the water and corpses rose. They drove between them toward the final door as the net filled with panic. But he kept his focus, filtering the feeds only for dry routes ahead. Throughout the entire run, the network's death counter ticked upward at a terrifying pace. Other descenders across the transit tombs were drowning in the very sea he outran. Names dropped from the leaderboard at a rate unseen since the last Great Wake. The survivor chat went dead silent on jokes, begging desperately for escape routes. They screamed for high ground, or any door the cult had somehow missed. Thousands of strangers he would never meet were learning the cult's ultimate lesson. In the end, the water always wins, and you only decide how fast you fall. He shut down the frantic chat. His path was set, and his people were moving. Riding the restored rails, the only number that mattered now was the remaining distance. The gap between their front wheels and the heavy door ahead, they reached the vault. The biovault shaft loomed as the rising flood closed in right behind them. The restored cars carried them across the final tomb section toward a sealed bulkhead. A massive pre-flood door blocked the rock wall where the descent path dropped down. Leading into the next layer, Lena was already there, treading water near the lock. She marked the lock. His people scrambled off the cars onto the last dry ledge. The war drone, the wounded, and the armed refugees packed onto a shrinking shelf. They crowded the stone shelf, while the sea swallowed the train wheels behind them. Out of habit, Sioha quickly set up defenses, even though only water approached. The net's death counter was a complete blur of constant updates by then. The system simply could not keep up with an entire layer drowning at once. The numbers climbed in a relentless surge, signaling the end of the tombs. The entire area was going under in real time. Familiar names started vanishing. Dozens of survivors vanished from the board in clusters. The chat fell silent. It slipped past panic into the dead silence of those who stopped expecting help. He scanned the quiet mechanism and shut the door behind him. Only one remained. He stood before it. There was nothing left but to open it and go down. And opening doors was the single thing on this sinking spire he had never failed. He pressed his hand against the biovault lock, letting his appraisal eye read. He expected the same deep history he had read on every corpse since the wake. The usual list of history, danger, and weak points, but it gave him absolutely nothing. Nothing. The scan of this ancient pre-flood lock came back completely blank. This was no simple, empty object. It was a barrier designed to stop him. A deliberate wall of darkness, a pitch-black void his unique eye had never met. He pushed harder. Still, the legendary appraisal eye that had guided him was failing. His sight, which always unlocked the history of the dead, yielded absolutely nothing. It returned a true, terrifying void. This was a lock his eye could not penetrate. He had no idea how to crack it. Water reached the last dry ledge. The freezing tide climbed his people's boots. The ocean was seconds away. The exit above was sealed shut. For the first time since the world broke, he stood before a door his power could not decipher, the tide rising to swallow them. He had no answers left. The lock remained stubbornly blank, refusing to yield. No matter how hard he pushed, the freezing sea kept rising to their knees. So he stopped. He abandoned the one trick he had always relied upon. His appraisal eye could not read this because the ancient pre-flood mechanism was built long before the system was born, leaving no entry in his database. The system simply had no record of tools forged by those ancient humans. And what the system cannot name, it cannot show him. He realized his mistake. He had been trying to scan a door his system was never designed to decipher. So he stopped reading it and pressed his bare hand against the metal. He reached past the blankness, focusing on the one thing he truly understood. The lock was completely broken. He let his restore skill trace the physical damage. He repaired it by touch, not by sight. He did not need its history. To know that it was dead, that was the true nature of his system power. His skill worked purely on the reality of the damage, not its background story. This ancient pre-flood mechanism was more broken than anything he had ever touched. The deadbolts had not turned in centuries. He blindly poured raw energy inside. He restored parts he could not even see, trusting his power completely. His ability easily located the dead bearings and corroded gears hidden inside. Suddenly, the ancient mechanism hummed, functioning even better than the day it was built. Every rusted gear loosened instantly, and the massive deadbolts snapped back. They drove open on restored power. The giant barrier swung wide. He did it. He successfully opened a door his system could not read. Now, the vault stood open. He quickly ushered his people inside, like shoving cargo through a closing hatch. They moved fast. Lena ran into the darkness to guard the other side. Sioha guided the massive war drone inside to anchor their landing spot. Neon rushed the injured down right behind the drone for maximum protection. Sayang stayed close at his side, carrying the valuable energy cores. The armed refugees quickly poured past them, escaping into the dry sanctuary. The ocean devoured the final dry ledge. Once the last hand was through, he followed. He pours a final charge into the restored lock and throws it shut from the inside. The heavy bolts slam home much harder than they opened, sealing them in. Meanwhile, the sea that had chased them across the drowning layer crashes against the far side of the door and stops. The tombs drown behind a wall he just restored, leaving them deep below it now. Sealed in the dark, they are dry and alive for the first time in hours. He lets himself study the room before resting, knowing an unchecked sanctuary is just an unsprung trap waiting for him. A trap you have not sprung yet. This place was nothing like what the concourse or the tombs had been. The concourse was just a flooded market to loot, and those tombs were a walking graveyard, but this facility is an ancient pre-flood laboratory. Sealed deep vault built by the dead city to lock away things it feared. And it survived the great drowning completely intact. Suddenly, his appraisal eye flashes open and pulls active readings again. History and danger flood back into his mind. Now that he has finally passed that one blank door, the data reveals that everything down here was engineered and nothing drowned by mere accident. Every security system was built to keep something terrifying locked inside. Let that sink in. To keep the ocean out, dead containment units run the entire length of vault. Sealed grids, deactivated fields, and holding cells line the dark walls. They are massive, and all of them powered down a generation ago, silent since. His skill scans the skeletal remains of the machinery as they move deeper inside. Cold power lines that once surged with energy and inactive grids that held fields are completely dead. Each was shut down systematically, just like that heavy door. Sabotaged on purpose or worn out by time, but always severed clean. There are no dark relics like in the tombs, nor bloated dead rising wrong. because nothing down here was ever exposed to the water long enough to drown. The massive biovault sealed itself the morning the world shattered, holding its breath ever since. Now they are the first warm presence to tread here in a generation, yet the drowned spire net still manages to reach him. What it displays is the exact complication he has been quietly expecting all along. He opens the global chat out of habit to size up this new layer, but the net is totally blank. The descent rank board, which tracked his downward progress, is entirely frozen now. It shows his marker stuck at the lip of the shaft. It refuses to update because the public map terminates at that sealed door. The system has no data past this point, offering absolutely no map below. Just think about it, for the first time, he has stepped completely off the grid. No other descender in the chat can track him, and no scout can locate him. The interface that used to broadcast every oncoming threat is blind down here. It cannot see a single meter past the vault door he just locked shut. This means that for the rest of this layer, he is completely on his own. He is running blind, but so is anyone hunting him. He carefully weighs the situation. Being hidden means the Brian Hold cannot track his movements through the dark. The Salt-bound cannot block a path they do not even know exists. That is an incredible advantage for a man with two massive factions wanting him dead. But it also means no one up the spire will know if he dies here. No chat will report the junk man drowning in a forgotten tomb. If he vanishes from the board, he is gone forever, dead or just lost. He secured both halves and kept moving, knowing an invisible layer demands absolute speed. Reading this place before it read him was vital, and his appraisal eye was already active. The skill was already showing him the massive shape of whatever the creators had built this vault to hold. Old Marin caught up to him at the front. The veteran was half blind and slow, but this drowned lab did something strange. To the old salvager's face that no upper floor had ever managed before, Marin knew. This place recognizing the exact type of pre-flood facility and the work done inside. These sealed chambers were familiar to him. Meanwhile, his crew saw only cold, dark tunnels and dead power grids to pass, but Marin saw a haunting memory. The old man fell quiet in that specific, heavy way seasoned survivors do. Whenever a deep descent exposes a dark truth the world wanted buried forever. He noted that silence but said nothing. Marin only spoke when he wanted to. Not a single second sooner, pushing a stubborn old survivor for hidden secrets. Usually gets you the wrong answers and a whole lot of extra trouble. Guided by his appraisal eye and Lena's scouting, they pushed deeper into the vault. Passing row after row of silent containment cells toward the core, the deeper they went, the heavier the architecture became. The cells expanded and security grids grew. Denser, these systems were no longer designed to hold simple specimens, but rather massive anomalies that required an entire vault to themselves. He read the scale of this architecture as a clear warning message left behind by the creators. No one wraps a harmless specimen in this much thick, reinforced steel. The old city had poured its absolute finest engineering into whatever lay at the very bottom. And all that effort was meant to keep something in, not keep invaders out. Which proved the true danger down here was never the rising flood water. The lab feared its own cargo. At last, the heart of the biovault opened. His appraisal eye scanned the entire massive chamber in a single split second. Way before his crew's flashlights could even reach the opposite wall. A massive containment grid stood right in the center, dark and completely silent. Surrounded by dead force fields built on a scale the rest of the lab merely hinted at. Inside, he read a colossal, motionless shape, a titan dead for a generation. The grid was constructed around this nightmare, rather than built to cage it. This beast was the entire reason the facility existed, but its cage was completely dead. Its containment fields failed decades ago, leaving only one shield left. That shield was simple inertia and the desperate hope that nothing ever woke it. His appraisal eye mapped the dead system, turning a mystery into a problem. The containment grid was not a simple lock he could blindly force open. He could not just blindly throw raw power at it like the entrance. It was a complex chain, a precise sequence of nodes requiring perfect order. Each node triggered the next, and the sequence was written nowhere in this facility. A grid like that fed its fields in sequence. One mistake meant disaster. Starting the system out of order would not just fail to lock it. His eye warned him it would do the exact opposite of its design. Dropping the containment fields it should raise, and raising what should be down. The massive, dormant terror the ancients sacrificed so much to cage would break free. Unleashed directly into a sealed room with his crew, with absolutely no escape. With the path open behind them, they reached the grid only to find someone already there. His appraisal eye scanned the stranger before the man's flashlight could even drift their way. A figure crouched there, salvaging gear was laid out all around him. He was working. Our hero's eye instantly revealed three critical details about him. His name was Cho Wanjai, and he possessed a real, honest repair talent. A genuine ability, though much weaker than what his own crew could forge. Finally, an actual restorer who was not just running a fake charm. But he had been down here way too long, days, judging by his worn-out gear and hollow face. He was losing, badly, failing against the very lock our protagonist had just deciphered. Cho simply could not see the hidden sequence that this system grid demanded. The man stood up as their flashlights crossed him. He glared at them. That glare, the exact same look he had been getting from survivors all day. It was a sneer driven by rumor, proving the stranger definitely recognized him already. Word of the famous junk man had traveled fast, even down to these deep ruins. Cho had spent his long, dark hours down here, deciding how to judge him. His mind was entirely made up, and he immediately spoke with arrogant pride. Cho claimed he was a true scholar, here to do what amateurs could not. He had descended early to handle the real work before the crowds arrived. He never expected the only other visitor to be the Spire's most famous fraud. Yet there the junk man stood, looking at the lock the scholar could not crack. Our hero did not argue. Fighting over a petty opinion is a waste of breath. It is always much better to let undeniable results speak for themselves. Instead, he calmly asked the man what he had found and how far he got. Cho answered warily, caught between treating him as a rival or an idiot. He had struggled alone with this incredibly massive puzzle for 3 agonizing days. In all that time, he had only restored 2 dead nodes by hand. That slow, painstaking work had completely drained almost all his spiritual energy reserves. Yet the chain never even flickered. One mistake in the sequence ruins everything. The real problem was simple. Cho had absolutely no way to read the correct order. His talent could repair a node, but it could never tell him what came next. And the ancient creators had left no physical clues to guide him. That was the massive gap between them, and our protagonist saw it instantly. Cho had the highly skilled hands, but not the eyes. He was working completely blind. He was just guessing, wasting precious days proving each blind attempt wrong. Meanwhile, our hero's appraisal eye had pulled the sequence off the grid instantly. He knew the correct pathway the moment he stepped up to the terminal. The secret correct layout was built right into the ancient system architecture. He decoded the entire layout in the time it took Cho to explain his struggle. This little rivalry was already over. Talk about an absolute reality check. The only question left was whether to tell him gently or just show him. He chose to make an offer instead of just crushing the man's pride. Humiliating a potential ally might feel good, but it costs you a valuable hand. Down in these dark, dangerous depths, he needed capable hands far more than pride. His offer was simple. He had the vision, and Cho had the manual skill. Combining those skilled hands with his visual talent would get them through. He promised the cage would wake up this watch, even though Cho had wasted 3 full days getting nowhere. Cho simply did not believe him. Days of failing alone in a dead lab had completely drained his faith. He demanded proof before wasting another drop of precious energy on a total stranger's word. So the young man offered the cheapest proof. He had to settle the matter once and for all. He called out the exact order of the 2 nodes Cho had already managed to restore. Something he could not have possibly guessed unless his eyes could truly peer into that complex grid. The doubt melted off Cho's face. From that moment, they began working together. Their joint effort quickly revealed what the chatter had sacrificed 2 whole layers, refusing to accept. The protagonist read the steps node by node, and Cho restored the very first target. But it took almost everything the scholar had left, draining him to his absolute limit. The dead node revived under his hands, agonizingly slow, burning through his talent like wildfire. A single activation had completely depleted him. When it finally locked in, he slumped back, pale and exhausted. Just 1 node finished, and the chain was still incredibly long. Then our hero stepped up. He placed his hand on the next node, restoring it far beyond its original maker's design. The entire process cost him barely a fraction of energy, a minor loss he would easily recover soon. While 1 node had completely hollowed Cho out, the exact same work barely touched the hero's reserves. Cho Wanjai watched this massive difference in silence, his mind completely blown by it. It was the silence of a man rewriting everything he knew. Before the young man even finished the third node, Cho spoke up, driven by undeniable proof. He showed the rare honesty of a scholar who simply could not argue with facts anymore. The man who came to expose a fraud was now watching him solve a 3-day puzzle in minutes. He was effortlessly restoring nodes far beyond Cho's best level, while barely breaking a sweat. Seeing this, the scholar admitted straight up that he had been completely wrong about him. Whatever the elites upstairs claimed, this raw talent was definitely no parlor trick. In fact, Cho confessed he had never witnessed a restoration run this clean or deep. It was not meant as empty praise, because Cho simply was not that kind of person. This was just a strict intellectual acknowledging an undeniable result he could not possibly dispute. And our hero knew that someone who could admit their mistakes so cleanly was worth keeping. So he decided to keep the scholar close, dividing the labor to maximize their efficiency. Cho handled the basic tasks while the young man did the impossible. Their alliance was sealed. Sure, he could have restored every single node alone, but that would be a foolish waste. Burning all his energy here would leave him completely defenseless for the trials waiting below. Cho's help allowed him to preserve his power. The scholar took charge of the easier nodes. Tasks a precise specialist could easily handle without draining their vital energy reserves completely dry. Meanwhile, our protagonist mapped out the sequence and tackled the high-risk, heavily locked nodes himself. Places where one tiny mistake would collapse the field, together they made rapid progress. Cho spared the hero's energy, while the hero's unique eyes spared the scholar from guessing. The tense rivalry that began with sneers quickly transformed into a highly efficient partnership. After all, this ruined facility did not care who had been ridiculed on the surface. Node by node, the massive chain woke up as they steadily worked their way down. The dead grid roared back to life, exactly the way its ancient creators had intended. Energy barriers flared, and the cage began locking down around the massive, motionless creature inside. Cho understood the gravity of their actions far better than he had let on. As they approached the final nodes, the scholar voiced a question that should make anyone shudder. Why would anyone build such a deep, heavily fortified cage around a single dead entity? He gave Cho the honest half of the answer, explaining that no one spends this much steel and sequence on a corpse unless that dead body is the most dangerous thing they own, and that the creators had clearly feared the day this exact grid failed. Cho went quiet at that because he had spent 3 days trying to make the cage work. Without once asking what it was for, they restored the last node together, and the containment chain closed exactly how the builders had drawn it, with every field rising in its keyed order until the cage stood whole again around its cargo. For the first time in a generation, the grid did not seal the thing away. That was the part Cho and he had both missed until the chain ran complete and showed them its. And honestly, a containment grid built this deep was never just a cage. It was a control and run in the right sequence. It did not lock the cargo down but woke it under hold, bringing the huge, stilled shape back online inside fields strong enough to govern what they had restored. The cage opened onto the vault's true heart as the last field rose. Inside, no monster was waiting to be killed. Using his appraisal, he read it completely. What it showed him was not a danger to put down but a guardian to bring back. The lab's apex construct, dead a generation, waited at the bottom of the deepest vault on the spire for a hand. His appraisal analyzed the apex construct down to its dead core before his hand had crossed the last field. The reading told him what the builders had spent their best steel to contain, a bioconstruct raised as the lab's guardian, engineered before the flood to hold this vault against whatever the old city feared more than the sea. It stood 3 times the height of Seo's war drone and twice the bulk, a thing of grown plate and fused bone that had been alive in the way the lab made things alive, and it had died under hold. A generation ago, with its core stilled rather than broken, that was the whole reason why the grid had keyed so hard, because the cage was not built to keep the construct in but built to keep it asleep. The old city wanted its guardian on a leash it could drop at need, and the morning the world broke. That leash it stilled with everything else. He read the death of it and found the same engineered break he had found in every dead thing down here, a core powered down clean rather than rotted through, a guardian set to sleep and never woken. The men forged did not need the construct's whole history to know it. was dead, and he did not need to be told that a thing this size was the most dangerous restore he had ever set his hand to. He waited, weighing every break for what it cost against what it bought, and the sum came close to what he had half known it would since the cage showed him its cargo. Imagine a guardian this size restored. A tier above the day it died would be the strongest creature any descender on the spire could field, and it sat here under hold waiting for the one talent that could bring it back. Cho watched him read it and went still. He had spent 3 days believing the thing at the bottom was a monster to survive. He had read it as his to raise. Even so, he did not pour charge into it blindly like he had taken. A door run wrong stays shut, but a guardian run wrong wakes hostile in a sealed vault with his people at its feet, so he read the construct's core to its dead nodes before he spent a single charge, and his eye gave him the binding order as it had given him the grid. Before this, he had done a bound restore. Controlling a war drone was simple, almost trivial compared to this colossal beast. The machine had awakened the exact moment its power surged, knowing instantly who its master was. But this construct was no mere machine, requiring a connection buried deep within its living core. As the energy field expanded, the Guardian arose bound to him just as it once served the very city that grew it. He held the complex command steady in his mind. He placed his hand flat against the silent core to let his restoration skill target the dead components. It repaired the machine by analyzing the physical damage, ignoring its history. The massive power draw would have completely drained Cho, leaving him a hollow gray shell for hours, but this flowed steadily from the junk man's own vast reservoir, pushing him close to his limits. Yet his energy never ran dry, because his internal forge grew stronger with every single layer. This ancient guardian was simply the largest thing he had ever been forced to mend. The dormant core revived, upgraded an entire tier above its original peak state, every armor plate. Each plate knit back together, and the fused metal bones snapped back into perfect alignment. As the final node activated, the cage's energy field secured the binding. He locked the control leash into the core. The exact second life returned to the beast. Immediately, the Guardian woke up completely bound. For 3 days, Cho had dreaded this very creature. Yet it rose under the junk man's immense healing power in mere hours, opening a massive core the size of a train car to scan its new master the instant it lived. The massive head turned, it locked its gaze on him. His strongest servant stood restored, surpassing even its original creator's limits, bound forever to him inside the very vault built to. Now the ultimate defensive weapon answered solely to the junk man. Lena let out a low whistle from the shadows, her signature diver's grin spreading wide across her face. It was the first sound his companions had made since entering. She spoke to the darkness loud enough for him to hear, but quiet enough to avoid sounding like a compliment. Saying she had braved 3 floors of monsters just to fight, but the junk man had made the massive beast his personal pet. Her playful smirk lingered long after. Sioha kept her hand steady on the war drone's anchor without moving a single muscle, but her perspective shifted rapidly from a captain bracing for a desperate fight into a commander evaluating a powerful new weapon. That cautious, tactical reassessment meant far more to him than loud cheers from anyone else. Sayang then approached, standing close to his shoulder while still holding the core, staring at the titanic beast with the deep respect a salvage engineer holds for a wrecked ship that miraculously manages to stay afloat. Her grudging respect had faded 2 entire floors ago. Neon remained silent, quietly guiding her injured mount closer to the looming guardian's feet. Now that the entire vault was under their command, that small, subtle shift represented the silent medic's profound gratitude. Not a single person spoke of fraud. Honestly, who could call him a fraud after witnessing a legendary feat like this? His bare hands had just rebuilt the very monster the ancient world feared most. Before he fully analyzing the massive construct, its reactivated core gifted him something unexpected. The Guardian, built to protect a vault, stored the entire vault's memories in its core. Exactly like the war drone kept its final orders, the restoration process that revived the construct also unlocked the last records it recorded before the developers put it to. These memories flashed vividly behind his eyes while he maintained the heavy psychic link. Suddenly, he was no longer standing in a flooded lab at the spire's dark base. Instead, he witnessed the pre-flood world in all its blinding, majestic glory. Dry, standing towers, he saw the old concourse, a bustling market back then. A market under open skies, a city, not a grave. The construct stood guard, over everything, but then the memory shifted. It showed the morning it ended. And the system core revealed the truth. What came down on that city was no natural act of sea or quake. What the memory revealed was a brutal drowning. Directly witnessed by the Guardian, this was no accident. He watched in complete silence. Figures moving at the city's dying edges. Instantly, his appraisal eye locked on them, pulling a name from the core record. Before, he had found only blanks. The unmakers, the ones named in the transit log before the system buried it. They had come to this bright city on purpose, and they had sunk it deliberately. They opened the deeps under Drownspire, forcing the ocean into a world with no floods in its design. They put the Guardian to sleep. Before it could fight back, this city did not drown, it was deliberately drowned. A hidden hand wanted it underwater. The proof remained in the Guardian's court, held the evidence through generations of darkness, waiting for someone to read it. And now he found more. This vault held more than just the Guardian. His appraisal eye easily found them, now that the cage answered to his power. Set into the floor was an ancient relic the builders had hidden away. Sealed away deeper than the Guardian itself, his appraisal eye read it whole. Pre-flood stronghold restore, keyed entirely to a massive district-wide scale, a device. It did not just mend a simple door, it restored an entire territory at once. It sat dead like everything else, waiting for a hand to power it up. Yet what it offered could easily turn a sealed vault into a waiting fortress. Beside it, the lab cached a massive pre-flood charge tier, a relic that raised the absolute limit of his energy reservoir. It was the vast difference between mending a single Guardian and restoring a whole city. He took it first. His eyes widened as his maximum energy capacity soared past all previous limits. A deeper well for a far heavier pour, but the stronghold restore. He left dead for now, spending a massive relic at the wrong moment. It was just wasted charge. He wasn't ready to anchor here yet, and a wise man who fortifies before choosing his ground only fortifies the wrong place. He analyzed and banked both immediately. The vault that had cost him so much to reach had just handed him the power to fortify an entire district, and the charge to run it. He held everything at once, the bound Guardian, the relic and proof of a deliberate drowning, the memory in the constructs. Core played its last beat, then went silent. In the dying city at the edge of the deeps the unmakers opened, one figure stopped dead. It had moved with the others through the drowning the Guardian witnessed, and now it turned slowly, away from the work of sinking a world, and looked directly at the observing eye. His appraisal eye read the face instantly. It read the threat clearly. For the first time since waking, the system did not give him a blank space or a name buried in a log. It flashed a sharp, immediate flag. Directly on the figure that turned, the Tidrite and Unmaker, the hand that had opened the deeps under Drownspire, that face from a long-dead memory, stared right at him, holding his gaze. The flag carried a name that changed everything. One truth remained: a restorer had finally reached the biovault. It knew because it was looking back, while the Guardians secured the vault behind them. For the first watch, he let his exhausted team rest, a dry, safe room. The clean silence was exactly what the old veteran had been waiting for. A silence deep enough to finally share a heavy, long-carried truth. Marin approached the surveyor, whose mind still reeled from the construct's memories. The old man sat down slowly across the dead grid, like a blind man. He began speaking in the calm voice of someone done with hiding. Secrets were over. The old salvager knew this exact type of vault. He recognized the shadowy figures before the surveyor could even identify them. Yet Marin chose silence on the upper layers because this truth was terrifying. It was a revelation that would make any sane climber freeze in horror. "Stop descending and you drown," Marin spoke in a low, even tone. His steady words revealed the dark pattern behind all those fragmented records. The flood was deliberate. It was just as the Guardian had shown. The construct memories proved it, but the conspiracy ran incredibly deep. The Unmakers did not drown single cities by some random act of malice. They flooded entire worlds on purpose, following a cold and calculated pattern. They targeted civilizations that rebuilt too fast and climbed too high. Any society crossing the unspoken line of the Unmakers was marked for death. Once they crossed that line, those monsters rose from the deepest oceans. They brought the sea itself. Drownspire was one of those doomed worlds. The city built too high, and the Tidrite unleashed the endless ocean. It dragged the world down into the dark. The surveyor sat in silence. He let the old salvager keep talking, since the truth was finally spilling. A slow confession is a complete one. The drowning was just the beginning. The second phase of this cruel plan was the massive descent itself. The ranking system tracked every survivor as they fell toward the abyss. And trust me, absolutely nobody on that spire understood its true purpose. Marin spelled it out clearly. The entire descent was a culling. The ranking system was never a gift left behind by the dead ancestors. It belonged to the Unmakers, designed to finish what the Great Flood started. The system sorted the strong from the weak with mechanical precision. It pushed the most powerful survivors deeper into the dark. The Unmakers waited there. That revelation turned the young surveyor's stomach. He made the old veteran repeat the words to be absolutely sure. But get this, the leaderboard was never meant for friendly competition. It was a selection tool to see who was worth harvesting next. The weak died, the strong grew more concentrated with every layer. Every relic gathered pushed survivors higher up the deadly leaderboard. But climbing higher only meant getting served up as the premium prize. The best survivors became the ultimate harvest for the lurking monsters. Those corrupted cores flowing down into the dark were not waste. They were the literal prize, the pure energy of a ruined civilization. The strongest humans were simply the main course of their feast. Part of that yield, the system was never their tool, but the Unmaker's harvest, and they had been climbing the board to make themselves worth reaping. He held all of. Against everything, his own eye had read down 5 layers and found that it fit every blank and every flag falling into the shape Marin had finally named. And then he understood the one piece the old salvager had not yet said, and maybe did not fully know. The forged men he made did not fit this harvest because everything the Unmakers had built ran in one direction, directly toward unmaking the flood. Unmaking the city, the descent unmaking the survivors, and the corrupted cores. Carrying that unmade strength down into the dark, against all of it his talent ran. The other way, restore was not salvage, and it was not making, it was the exact reverse of unmaking, a power taking what was broken and driving it back. Past whole, and a harvest built to unmake a world had no place in its design for a hand that could put the unmade back. He was not a richer part of the yield, but the absolute opposite of it, restoration set against unmaking. At the root, and the harvest had no answer for him because it had never been built to be opposed. A machine that sorts the strong to be eaten has a slot for every single strong thing it can name, and the strongest climbers fall down those slots one after another toward the dark that waits to take them. What the machine did not have was a slot for a hand that could reach into the eaten and pull it whole again. He did not yet know what that gap was worth, only that it was real. That was why the system had flagged him where it left everyone else unread, and why his own stats stayed hidden from his own eye while it read every other survivor down to the bone. This harvest could not catalog a thing that worked against it, the same as his appraisal eye could not read the pre-flood lock because the system had no entry for what came before the break. He sat outside the design entirely. That was why the tide right had turned in a generation-dead memory to look at the eye that watched it, why the flag had carried his arrival at the biovault as a fact the Unmaker already knew. The deeps were not coming for him because he had climbed the board, those strong climbers the descent fed down were the harvest working as built. He was something else entirely, a restorer reaching the places the Unmakers had sealed, reading the truths they had drowned, and the tide right was coming for him by name because of it. Marin watched him reach the end of it and saw that he had gotten there, and the old veteran's relief at not having to say that last part out loud told him the salvager had known it for some time and dreaded the saying. He did not thank Marin for the telling, and Marin did not want thanking. What the old salvager wanted was for him to understand the size of what he was, which was not a survivor who had gotten strong, but a thing the architecture of the whole drowning had no slot for, and to understand it before the tide right reached him rather than after, he understood it well enough. Sitting in the dry vault with his guardian holding the dark, he turned the whole shape of it over once more, where another man might have felt the size of the thing settle on him as fear. He felt it settle as a tool, the one advantage a harvest this thorough had left lying on the table, so he did the practical thing with the knowledge before he let himself sit any longer in the weight of it. The deep heart of the massive underground vault still held forgotten relics his appraisal eye had completely missed. Knowing exactly what he faced, he searched the dusty shelves for his salvation. He tracked down the bypassed relic, a small pre-flood device. It sat sealed beside the stronghold restore, seemingly dead like everything else around him. His appraisal eye had flagged it as a mere curiosity, but knowing Marin's truth. It was no curiosity, it was a counter, a pre-flood device built to delay unmaking, a last defense the dead city raised against the rising. Depth. He restored it quietly, upgrading its power. While the team rested and Marid looked away, the device returned. Small and cold in his hand, a brief stand against world-drowning forces. It would hold off the unmaking for the length of just one short breath. It was next to nothing against a power that sank entire cities, and yet one breath at the right moment was all it took. To keep his hands from being undone, he told no one he had it. Hiding the device from Marid, Sayuan, and the rest, a counter to unmaking was the one card the Tide Right wouldn't expect him to hold. And a card the Deeps knew nothing about was his only real defense. Against a threat that knew him by name, once the team rested, they moved down toward the shaft, dropping below the biovault, heading for the Brinehold layer, crossing back under the reach of the public map. The net detected him at the lip of the drop, the descent board. Blind to him inside the sealed vault, caught his marker the moment he stepped back into range. It instantly updated every bit of standing. He had banked off the map, landing on the board in one massive jump. His rank shot straight into the top 10 as players watched in shock. He immediately saw the targets on his back. A top 10 descender drew deadly eyes that a junk man never would. Prefect Haldan's hand immediately reached down to seize his rank, which outclimbed his own. Then the saltbun came for him. The flood cult targeted a restorer who had breached a sealed vault. He returned stronger than ever. Two rival factions converged on one man. One to seize his power and one to drown it. He tracked both threats on the net before they could reach him. That was his ultimate advantage. Reading the board where others only fight, the net revealed their formations. The moment his rank crossed the top 10, the Brinehold marched as a column, with Prefect Haldan's forces moving down the spire in perfect, disciplined order. They wielded the hoarded high-grade gear of the upper layer's rulers. Determined to seize a rising descender, behind them the saltbound surged. Like a tide, a deadly, disorganized swarm spreading down the pathways. These fanatic believers were fed by an unmaker, sent to drown a restorer. Their drowned god wanted dead, two factions converging on one shaft. One to own him and one to end him, yet the net tracked them both. While neither faction could see a single step into his own hidden plans. He waited, reading their paths to prepare his counter. And he decides to bet everything on the single move that solves it all. The deep heart of the vault still held the stronghold restore power. He banked and left dormant, and now he finally has the perfect reason to unleash it, for this holding. To anchor himself, he uses the biovault antechamber, a massive sealed room deep below. The reach of any public map, built with a single shaft and one drowned door. The exact kind of choke point that forces invaders to bleed for every single inch, giving the defender a massive home turf advantage. He reads the ancient relic to its core, holding the massive blueprint in his mind, just like he held the Guardian binding before. Placing his hand on the machine to let the restoration sweep away all the decay in. A system built to rebuild an entire fortress instead of just a door or drone. This was the most massive drain the system had ever demanded of his power, far larger than the Guardian, and the power he channeled earlier was the only reason his own energy reservoir did not run completely dry right in the middle of the work. The charge pours out of his body until he collapses onto the floor of his expanded soul. And the antechamber suddenly roars back to life, a fortress reborn even stronger than the day the ancient city first built it. Dormant power conduits sparked to life along the chamber walls, surging with energy as high-tech defense fields rise along the main shaft. The flooded exit door, now linked directly to his touch just like the Guardian itself, unlocks sealed armories that had been abandoned for ages, opening up their vaults to reveal ancient high-tech weapons his allies have no business holding. This hidden room stops being just an empty, dusty chamber he barely cleared out, becoming a fully powered fortress instead. Charged walls hum with energy. Shields obey his command, and the main entry is practically impossible to force open. He feels the entire structure lock into place, instantly grasping how this completely changes the game for the two rival factions hunting him down. Neither can build The brine hold only has whatever ancient scraps they have managed to scavenge, obsolete. Tech they can never replace, while the salt-bound only have the lives their god sacrifices to them. Both enemies are throwing everything they have at him right now. But he just materialized a high-tech fortress out of thin air and dead stone. And get this, he did it on a level they cannot even perceive. This is the massive gap separating a man who can restore the ancient world from desperate factions who can only burn through the scraps they have looted. He has transformed the very bottom of the spire into an absolute fortress. In a matter of hours, using an ancient relic his enemies do not even know exists, his crew quickly arms themselves with the newly uncovered weapons as energy shields. Crackled to life around them, transforming the entire squad just like the Guardian did. Sioha grabs the newly restored heavy armor, scanning the tactical fields in the shaft, with the sharp, calculating gaze of a commander who was just given a base. To defend, nearby, the hardened ex-soldiers watch over Thav with a look that for the very first time resembles actual trust. Meanwhile, Cyan traces the active power lines with the pure excitement of a veteran tech scavenger. Neon carefully guides the wounded deep into the most heavily shielded corner, where nobody can touch them, showing a deep sense of relief on her face. Lena immediately stations herself at the mouth of the main entry shaft, as a lookout holding a high-tech rifle with a huge grin on her face. Word spread that the junk man had built a massive city to crush 2 entire armies. The armed refugees seized the gear and fields, no longer just a desperate crowd. He dragged away from drowning but a fully armed garrison before the saltbound closed in. The brinehold hit the edge of his fields, the very first move Prefect Holden's column made was what any smart faction does. Before attacking a stronghold, they sent a scout to read what lay ahead. He let the scout approach the very edge of his fields, letting them read the land. Just as he read them, it was Holden's own top appraiser, skilled at measuring defenses. Before the main army spilled any blood, that scout scanned his defense chambers. He watched the scout register the active power lines, the keyed fields, and the ancient armories, measuring a stronghold that easily outbuilt anything Brinehold had hoarded in its upper keeps. He saw utter shock hit the scout's face, who had come down expecting a cheap junk yard but found a massive fortress. Instead, the scout immediately retreated, climbing back to the column to report, while the net flashed the data up the spire ahead of him. Every scout's report goes directly to the command board. What this scout reported was something the entire network had spent 5 layers refusing to believe, now confirmed by Brinehold's top talent. In clear terms, Prefect Holden could not ignore. The junk man held a powered fortress at the bottom of the spire that completely outfortified anything Brinehold owned. Its charged walls, keyed fields, and pre-flood armories were the envy of any city. Built in a single watch on a layer no other faction could even see, Holden's column had descended to seize a target who had completely outclimbed their claims. The scouts' report proved they were facing a man who outfortified their entire stronghold. An army facing a battle that one-sided does not charge down the shaft immediately, so the Brinehold halted at the edge of his fields to plan. And planning takes time. Time was the ultimate weapon for a man who reads faster than he fights. Unlike them, the Saltbone did not pause to plan because a wild tide does not fear a wall. This flood cult reached his upper fields while the Brinehold still hesitated. He watched the swarm pour down the drowned roots toward the door he had restored before. His fields reacted instantly, answering them the same as any invading army, the door holding, the shaft holding, the entire system doing exactly what it was built for. While the cult shattered against his unyielding defenses, both threats were crushed against the exact same walls. Honestly, you love to see it. He kept them both completely at bay, standing entirely undefeated inside a massive fortress that the deeps could never pierce, with a powerful guardian standing at its heart. He had the ultimate counterweapon hidden in his coat. 2 factions converged to take him. Instead, they found an unbreakable city. He left the fields to his garrison and trusted the shaft to Sioha, heading alone into the deep heart of the vault where the Guardian kept watch, a man who has analyzed every threat the network can throw at him, sometimes needs to stand where it cannot reach. There, alone with the Guardian, he felt a new message arrive. It opened in his vision just like every system notification since the world woke, but something felt wrong. His appraisal eye immediately searched for the sender, scanning for potential danger only to find a total blank for the very first time. His appraisal eye, which decoded ancient tide rights across generations, had a limit. It could pierce dead memories and expose every survivor down to the bone. It stripped a scout's strength with a single glance, yet it failed now. This mysterious message sat right in his sight, its true origin completely hidden from him. It wasn't buried in logs or locked behind ancient seals, but actively hidden. Someone knew exactly how his appraisal eye worked and blocked his vision on purpose. The words were few, the mysterious sender remained completely hidden, so he read on. Meaning was completely clear: stop restoring the ancient spire and descend immediately. The order was plain, carrying a single reason that left no room for mistake. He was the only threat left to unmake, the last active hand on the spire. This entity had to extinguish him, just as he was born to destroy it in turn. The message knew him. It named the warriors forged to destroy this threat. It named the only talent set against the harvest, demanding he finish his mission. He had to go past the Brinehold layer, down into the deep trenches it opened. It drowned a city generations ago. Now, the Tide Right targeted him directly. He was named directly in a message his appraisal couldn't trace. Things are getting intense. This blind spot kept him and his guardian waiting in the dark for a long time. He could read absolutely everything on the spire except this. He read it again. He scanned the message multiple times, hunting for the source as he would any threat. Every pass returned a total blank. This was deliberate concealment, not a missing sender. The door had been shut on purpose by someone who already measured his abilities. The entity that drowned the world took the time to study how he read things. It countered his talent before he even knew it existed. This dangerous unmaker had struck. The enemy found the one person on the spire it absolutely hated, sending a warning. It sent its word in an envelope his eye couldn't crack, leaving him completely blind. He stood completely alone in the pitch black. He was at the bottom of the spire. Above him stood his fortress. Beside him, his loyal guardian kept careful watch. Two massive factions had broken on his walls, yet a hidden hand still threatened him. For the first time since waking, his cheat skill had absolutely no answers. Talk about terrifying. He ignored the deeps. He took his city down because replying meant instant defeat. Replying to something you can't read is basically just starting to obey its commands. He had a long descent to make first. The Tide Right demanded he freeze everything. They wanted him to stop restoring. He would only do what suited him. He was driving down the spire on his own clock, completely on his own terms. He kept his whole army at his back, refusing to crawl empty-handed to this enemy. Instead, he fired up the massive descent engine, which he had upgraded even further. After building it better than its original creators, he loaded up his entire garrison. He packed the cores and bound beasts, driving the whole spire toward the seal. They reached the layer below. The Brinehold wasn't just some ruined, drowned wasteland. It wasn't a graveyard either. His eye scanned it before they even landed. The engine settled. This was a fully surviving, functional city in the depths. It actually looked like a real civilization, not just wreckage. A fortified city-state built into a dry layer that the Great Flood had spared. It had working lights, sturdy walls, and a living population that hadn't perished. His appraisal eye opened, reading true order where previous layers had only shown chaos. The records from above showed a total collapse of authority. A ruthless chain of command ran from the prefects straight to the guards. The deeps drowned everything, but this single shelf remained dry. On this dry ground, Halden built a kingdom. But his kingdom's dark secret made the Junkman's blood run cold. The truth was chilling. Brinehold did not farm, salvage, or build. They simply hoarded and taxed. They built their order on a single resource. They controlled the very thing the upper layers were dying for: intact working gear. Since nobody could manufacture this tech anymore, their deep vaults were massive gold mines. These precious pre-flood deep stores had stayed sealed right on their shelf. Halden's ancestors walked straight into a vault of ancient weapons that still functioned. They built a city-state on simple logic: whoever owns the guns rules. In a drowning world, he held them by the throat. Descenders paid to pass, and survivors paid just to breathe the dry air. Absolutely everyone paid the tax bench, while the bench itself paid no one. This closed loop was the entire engine of the place. Zero mercy, you pay or you starve. And those without weapons paid with everything until they had nothing left. They paid with hard labor, then with their rights to descend further. The Junkman had seen 100 broken systems since the Great Collapse. A city designed to keep its citizens starved was like a rusted machine. It was just much bigger. A city that taxes dissent rights demands an immediate reckoning for newcomers. This reckoning was entirely public, and the junkman carefully sized up the room. It was a high court built for theatrical show as much as real judgment. At the head sat the tax bench, overlooking a gallery of tax-bled survivors. These desperate souls ran blindfold, their ranks tracked on a massive back wall. This board listed dissent ranks, and the gallery gathered to watch him closely. They wanted to see if the system would price this newcomer out completely. But get this, the board had him ranked in the top 10. That elite ranking was the only reason the prefect took the bench himself. Top-tier ranks get the leader, everyone else gets a clerk in taxes. Prefect Halden took his seat and made the junkman a smooth proposal. It was the same deal he offered every major stronghold arriving here. Masking his greed as mercy, Halden noted his rank and his fortress. His scouts had reported the massive stronghold proving force was completely impossible. The junkman's mobile defense simply outclassed the entire city's forces. So a vassal pact took its place, served the city Halden offered. He wanted him to repair their hoarded arsenals and run their workshops. In exchange, his people would get dry shelter within the city walls. But beneath the soft, polite words of the tax bench lay the catch. Halden demanded his entire stronghold and his absolute independence in exchange. Everything went directly to the prefect. His unique skills would be swallowed by the city's corrupt loop. The junkman would become another asset held by the throat. He stared back. Halden spoke because what a man offers is just talk, while his true position is reality. And the two rarely match. The junk man opened his appraisal system on the prefect. Looking past the grand bench, the heavy robes, and the entire city standing behind him, he saw the true hand the prefect was playing, a weak bluff disguised as power. Halden was weak. He did not offer him vassalage out of strength. He only offered it because he knew he could never take it by force. The prefect's grand walls hid a broken hold desperate for a real restorer. This offer was just a desperate attempt to secure what money could never buy. Trying to trade a simple shelter fee for a level of talent his wealth could not reach. The desperate need was obvious, revealing everything those fancy robes tried to hide. Truly confident leaders do not start by offering protection masked as kindness. They only do that when they realize their own forces are completely outmatched. When their resources fall short against an opponent they cannot break. So they turn to the only currency left when their weapons no longer fire. The mere illusion of generosity, Halden was not buying the junk man's talents. He was offering a drowning man's price while pretending to hand down a favor. Trading away his pride just to make a desperate rescue look like mercy. So the dissenter refused, a cold, practical rejection right to his face. The exact words of a man who saw the entire bluff for what it was. He told the bench he would shelter his own people behind his own walls. Absolutely nothing would be paid in independence for resources he could easily produce. The hold could have his restoration services, but only at a price he set. Keeping his land whole, keeping his talent, no voices were raised. No threats were thrown, because once a bluff is called, anger is useless. Giving up his independent fortress to them was something he simply declined to do. He let his refusal echo where the gallery could hear a top 10 dissenter, telling the prefect straight to his face that his mercy was just an expensive fee. The neck carried the news of the standoff the moment the court broke. And the local chats lit up as tax survivors watched the drama unfold. Overhead, the system board lit up with the news. Just look at this play. A bottom-shelf city-state that taxed working gear made a desperate offer. They approached a top 10 dissenter, only to get publicly rejected in open court. A prefect offering fake mercy, and a proud junk man who refused to be owned. People discussed it endlessly, half calling his bold move a complete fraud, while others finally respected a holding that could openly defy a kingdom. But the packed gallery downstairs reacted to the news very differently. The tax survivors filling the court had spent their entire lives paying up. Trapped in the prefect's loop, seeing a dissenter refuse to pay was shocking. It was something they had absolutely never seen done. Above ground, boards flashed. But down in the gallery, an intense silence fell over the heavy tax crowd. That heavy silence spoke volumes.